Welcome back to the 5th annual season projections for the Dynasty Basketball League. Once again, we have an awesome season ahead of us, and I can't wait to see how it all goes down. There's a lot of instances where a couple of players, rankings, and situations I predict are right on the money, but more often than not, my estimations fall flat on their face and are completely wrong. So keep that in mind when you hear my thoughts, and take everything I say with a grain of salt because I'm not always correct. I'm not here to offend or insult with my predictions. I'm here because I love the league and I want to give my genuine truths and views on how I think it's all going to shake out for the season. That doesn't mean it's always valid, and a lot of it is obviously opinionated, but I am the back-to-back champion, so maybe I do know a thing or two, but jokes aside, it's been a wild and busy offseason in the DBL as constant trade movement and juicy blockbuster transactions took place, but perhaps the craziest aspect of the offseason was the news of 3 whole league members retiring. And what better way to introduce one of the league's freshest faces than starting off with their ranking in last place? Yes, unfortunately for the man that replaced CJ only a month ago, I have Alec and the newly rebranded Yellowstone Pronghorns finishing in 10th place. Alec passed the interview stage to secure a spot in our league with flying colors and proved that before he even entered the DBL, he'd be supremely invested in this universe of ours. Once he joined, he was already showcasing an insatiable hunger to reinvent the franchise, actively shopping players and picks to create his very own vision heading into the year. Despite his effort and dedication, though, CJ and the former ball club didn't really leave him in a desirable position. The Shore Monsters were fresh off beginning a grand rebuild where they traded away the Greek Freak and Zion Williamson, and although Yellowstone is raking in the dough with all of the picks and future draft capital because of it, the actual roster that's heading into the current season is a less than average bunch that Alec will have to work with and game plan over the next handful of months to see where he wants to go next. I salute Alec and anyone that takes on a team that didn't get to build from the ground up themselves, but with the Shore Monsters' gargantuan blow up of the roster before piecing out, it's not really any secret that it's going to be a hard-fought battle for Yellowstone to even crack 4 wins. In a positive sense, at least Alec kind of has the opportunity to start from the bottom and make this entirely his world in a completely fresh start. As I already alluded to, these keepers aren't very good. I obviously mean no disrespect to Alec, as again, this was the roster he inherited and just had to roll with the punches, but it also doesn't help his case that he's brand new to the DBL, which means there's going to be a learning curve for anyone that isn't used to the ins and outs of our league. I think there's a decent bit of upside in some of these players, but in terms of winning a lot of fantasy matchups for this season alone, it may be pretty rough. Beginning with the guy CJ jeopardized his entire organization for, Tyrese Halliburton is the only elite player that the Pronghorns currently possess. While I still don't think he's worth 5 first-round picks, and it's irritating that this trade overwhelmingly reset the market, Halliburton is without question one of the best players to own in all of fantasy. Every league member wishes they had him for his youth, 20 and 10 consistency, efficient shooting, defensive stats, and ability to still get better. I wouldn't be surprised if Hallie managed to climb even further as a fantasy star this season. But after Halliburton, there's a significant drop-off with the rest of the team. Now, I think a solid chunk of the guys that I'm about to go over have a chance at being helpful participants in just this season alone, but the sad truth of the matter is that not only is Halliburton the only elite player on Yellowstone, he's also really the only proven one at all. Jordan Poole's next at bat, and even though he had an unremarkable final stint with the Warriors, he still averaged 20 points in a season where he clearly didn't want to be there anymore. I think there's a very high percentage that we see him have a stellar campaign with the Wizards. Are there downsides to Poole? Certainly. He could be a one-dimensional player akin to your Jordan Clarksons and Eric Gordons of the world. He could be mightily inefficient as the number one option circa Keldon Johnson, and even if he's a great addition in fantasy this season, does his game translate to being relative to the DBL for years to come? There's question marks, but you also take that chance on a guy who's still very young, has the keys to the offense, and likely averages close to 25 points per game. Through the Giannis trade, the Pronghorns were able to land Jalen Duren, and I think he's a very slept-on and overlooked keeper. Duren doesn't turn 20 until November, so not only is he unbelievably young, but he put up 9 and 9 in 25 minutes as a rookie. There's definitely a logjam in the front court for Detroit, what with James Wiseman, Isaiah Stewart, and Marvin Bagley, but in just one season alone, Duren's shown more upside than any of those guys. That doesn't mean there isn't going to be a time cap and a consistency issue, but I take the bet on him getting the bulk of the minutes over anyone else. Even if he still only averages like 24 minutes a game, you're looking at a young guy on a rebuilding roster who has all the time in the world to develop him and can still put up nearly 20 fantasy points a night. Assuming he gets close to 30 minutes a game, those 20 fantasy points can drastically improve to around 26. As for Tyrese Maxey, I certainly understand the argument that you have to be patient with young players, but from a fantasy perspective, it was wildly disappointing that he didn't really improve all that much last season. He went 4th overall in the 2022 draft and only averaged 19 fantasy points. With Harden gone, he should definitely see more usage and a lot more production, production, but with the Beard still in the city of brotherly love, there's reason to believe he's only going to be as good as like Tyler Hero or CJ McCollum at best from a fantasy points per game narrative. He has all the tools to flourish and really unlock his talents, and with what I'm assuming will be the Pronghorns in tank mode, they'll be happy to navigate through his struggles, but he just might not be quite that great again this year. Speaking of CJ McCollum, unfortunately for Alec, this is what I would call his first miss of a keeper. I haven't thought of McCollum as a keeper-worthy asset for over 3 seasons now, and while he's still a relatively fine piece that isn't a terrible choice in any way, it's also counterproductive to have an aging and regressed veteran alongside the rest of this team. Alec is new to our league and format, so I can't blame him when a lot of other people probably would have made this same mistake too, but his name value and at once thought to be future all-star talents don't hold the same weight they once did. Zion and Ingram both missed a majority of the schedule last year, and Jonas Valanciunas was only relegated to about 24 minutes a game, yet McCollum still couldn't net any more than 21 fantasy points a night. While that average is a passable mark, it's practically the value of a third-round draft pick rather than someone you lock in as a part of your main rotation. He could probably be counted on to continue this kind of low-end production, but as another year older, I wouldn't be surprised to see his average dip below 20. Two more guys the Pronghorns brought in to start their franchise with are Jalen Green and Austin Reeves. I haven't really been a fan of Jalen Green's offerings yet, with his sophomore season culminating in a pathetic 17 fantasy point per game average, but I do like his fit on this team as he finds his rhythm with a young and rebuilding roster. I'm not entirely convinced he's going to be this all-star caliber player, but Rocket Stan seems to compare his early year numbers and future trajectory to the likes of Devin Booker, who people forget was also pretty inefficient and didn't get a lot of counting stats early on either. So there's certainly hope for him, but as for now, with Fred VanVleet, Dylan Brooks, and all the other mouths to feed in Houston, I still see him averaging under 20 fantasy points. But that's fine when you barely have to give up any picks and commit to a tank. I feel similarly to Reeves. I don't really think he's as good as the masses and especially Lakers fans want to hype him up as, although I do think he's a skilled young talent. The problem though is that he's the third option to two of the best players in the NBA and doesn't have a lot of room for giant fantasy growth. I'm expecting something in the vicinity of like 21 fantasy points, which definitely makes him a more intriguing project and serviceable keeper than other young players, but I feel like he's better suited for a pick in the draft than someone who takes up a keeper selection. But this season will be important to see what he's worth going forward. Finally, let's talk about Markelle Fultz, another keeper that Alec went out of his way to obtain and lock in as a part of his core. I admire and appreciate the activeness right out of the gate, but unfortunately this was not a very good move. The beauty of it, however, is that Alec can learn from this, as we've all made mistakes or trades really without sitting on them, and to this day are still prone to doing so. Look, if Yellowstone brought in Markelle Fultz for like a 4th round pick, I wouldn't necessarily be a fan of it, but it'd be a small enough move to feel indifferent about. You could certainly make the argument it could potentially work out at such a minuscule price. But trading a 2nd round pick and a 3rd round pick for a player that may not have even gone in the first 3 rounds of the draft and Gio 1,000,000,000% wasn't keeping is absolutely an overpay. I mean, to put it in perspective, this trade went through with like 2 weeks left of the offseason, so that goes to show the level of interest in acquiring Fultz as a keeper was virtually non-existent. I like Markelle. I always think he's an interesting guy to take a risk on in the later part of the draft each year, but he's always hurt, and at every time it seems like he's finally on the cusp of breaking out, it never quite happens. He's still young enough to become some version of something appealing, but I don't really think it's going to happen at this point. Even if he remains at what he was last year, which was decent for like the 11th guy on your squad, 19 fantasy points isn't enough to warrant a 2nd or a 3rd individually, never mind packaged together. Maybe he takes off and progresses to like 22 fantasy points, but that's still a hefty amount to give up for that caliber of player, and I just don't really see it with Banchero, Wagner, and all the other rotational cogs in the Orlando offense. In the end, I'm really not too keen on this group of keepers, especially if we're looking at it from the standpoint of winning games this season. I'm only really big on Halliburton, Poole, and Duren, and maybe Maxey when looking towards the future, but if Alec plans on continuing this rebuild that CJ started, it's not an awful way to enter the year since it would be all about tanking and hoarding draft picks. But if Yellowstone did indeed want to go that route, you'd also like to see a guy like CJ McCollum removed from the equation. Looking at Alec's draft, it was obviously a bit of a peculiar situation since he wasn't able to actually attend the draft or be present via Zoom, so we congregated our minds to select whoever hadn't been taken yet if they were up next in his rankings. So never mind that Alec is new and is already at a bit of a disadvantage drafting-wise, he also didn't technically make his own choices for his team either, but we have to believe these would have mostly been his selections based on the order he provided. First up, however, was the most obvious pick of the whole draft after Wemby, when Alec received Scoot Henderson with the 2nd overall pick. Look, whether he's amazing or subpar in his rookie year, this is the incontestable decision to make. I expect him to have free reign for the most part, and having a guy like Chauncey Billups mentor him should result in even quicker NBA readiness, but Portland's guard depth makes things a bit murky for the time being. Next to Scoot, you have Anthony Simons, Shaedon Sharpe, and the possibility of Malcolm Brogdon actually suiting up for a portion of the season too. You can make the argument that if any of those guys had their own team, they'd be hot DBL commodities, each with the ability to put up 20 points per game. Again, Scoot was a top 3 pick in the NBA draft and will probably be trusted as the main conductor of the offense, meaning he could average like 19 points, 6 assists, 4 rebounds, and 22 fantasy points as a rook, which makes his future all the more enticing, but I also see a reality where he finishes the year at only about 17 fantasy points. 2 picks later, with the 4th overall spot in the draft, Alec got OG Anunoby, who I'm not really a fan of when it comes to our league. In my opinion, anywhere in the 2nd round would have been too early to take OG, but the 4th overall pick is crazy early for a player of his caliber. He averaged 20 fantasy points last year, which is pretty much exactly what I expected out of him. That's a satisfying 11th to 13th player on your team, but using a first rounder on the guy probably isn't in anyone's best interest going forward. Is there a chance he can finally break out? Well, I know he's been in trade rumors for a while, so if he could find his way to a team where he settles in as the 2nd or 3rd option, maybe his average goes up to 23 or 24 fantasy points. Even if he does that with the Raptors this season with FEV and H-Town, I don't see his talents being justified with a selection this high in the draft. Moving on to the 3rd round, Yellowstone signed Andrew Wiggins to the Pronghorns, and I don't really mind this selection. If you've been listening to these videos for years, you know I'm not big on Wiggins when it comes to fantasy, but at the beginning of last season, he was very impressive before he got hurt and sat out for personal reasons, interrupting his flow and causing him to fall back down to earth at around 19 fantasy points per game. I expect another season close to 19 or 20 fantasy points, as someone like Chris Paul could hypothetically hurt or help his chances of being productive in the DBL. For the 26th pick in the draft, it's a pretty solid pick, but I wouldn't be shocked to see him end up on the waiver wire by the midpoint of the season either. Speaking of Warriors, with the 46th pick, Alec elected to choose Draymond Green, and this is actually my favorite pick of his outside of Scoot. Number 30's expensive backpack is certainly not as consistent or valuable as he was in the early Dub Nation Dynasty days, and now approaching the age of 34 in March as well as racking up a long list of injuries, he's not someone most league members are extremely invested in these days. But for a late 5th round pick, this could wind up being one of the best choices in the entire draft. He can still put up his usual 8, 6, and 6 leading to 21 or 22 fantasy points a night, which is an unquestionably beneficial asset to add so late in the draft. Yes, Chris Paul being in Golden State could take playmaking opportunities away from Money 23 Green, and the old veteran presence on the Pronghorns just clashes with the young spirit of the rest of the team, but this could still be a great draft pick that winds up becoming a prime trade deadline candidate for Yellowstone. Lastly, Jarace Walker was taken in the follow-up draft, and I don't mind the flyer at all, especially for the Pronghorns. These are probably the kinds of players they should be monitoring, rookies or young players that have potential upside. I don't think he'll be starting with Obi Toppin in Indiana, but it's possible that he does, or at the very least split minutes evenly at the power forward position. However, he may be one of those rookies that gets very limited run early on, so I'm skeptical of how impactful he'll be within the next few years, let alone this season. But either way, I endorse this pick considering Alec's position in the league right now. Overall, this is not a horrifyingly putrid draft under any circumstance, especially for his first go of it in the DBL, but it's not going to do the Pronghorns many favors either. I expect most of these players to be pretty inconsequential by season's end, but as far as I'm concerned, Alec still walks away a winner from the 2023 draft by obtaining Scoot and solidifying him as a core component moving forward. As I said, we can't really be too critical or judgmental of any of Alec's decisions or choices for the year. We'd all be panicking and unsure of how to go about every day in the DBL if we were first-time members in a league filled with people who've now been participating for half a decade. So even when I'm not high on trades or keepers or draft selections or whatever else I've mentioned throughout the video, I can't blame the Pronghorns for any of their actions. Also, just because I'm not high on those concepts, that doesn't mean I actually know what the fuck I'm talking about either. These are just my feelings and thoughts, but at the same time, I'm proud of Alec and the challenges he's had to face thus far. I think he's done a worthwhile job at trying to maneuver through our league early on. However, it is going to be a challenging season for him, not just because he's a newcomer, but because it'll be depressing to have to face as many losses as he will this year. But hopefully, that won't deter him from following through with a rebuild and trying his hardest to win games. I think there's a chance we see the Pronghorns finish as high as 9th place if they make a few trades and some of their keepers develop even further than expected, but when you account for the inexperience and lower tier talent of some of the names on the roster, I gotta lock them in for last place and prepping for a professional presentation to the league. Finishing in ninth place this year, I've got the former champions and the Maryland McLovins. It's been a roller coaster of emotions for Josh and the McLovins over the course of the DBL's tenure, bringing his franchise to an all-dumbass selection in the first season and following up that year's pitiful performance by winning an MVP and securing a championship. Since then, it's been a gradual decline into mediocrity where the past 2 seasons saw Maryland hang on to a playoff spot by the skin of their teeth. Now, things don't look too bright as it appears this will finally be the season that Josh isn't able to compete past the initial schedule. The McLovins have proved me wrong before, but after their 2021 championship, I also thought they were about to become a surefire dynasty. What happened in the 2 to 3 year time frame since? Incessant and unnecessary tinkering, baffling trades, and a bit of a competitive edge lost. Josh is one of the most caring and committed managers in the league, but I personally feel like that hunger that put him over the top in 2021 has gotten less and less substantial. That year was an all-time great season and consisted of a crazily stacked roster. Josh won MVP, GM of the Year, Trader of the Year, All-Fantasy, the conference title, and of course the championship, but has only collected a Steals Leader award in 2 seasons since. It just seems like the McLovins increasingly blew up their team in the years that followed their championship, and for absolutely no reason at all. The irony is that now Josh definitely needs to keep toying with his team and changing the configuration of the McLovins because as they currently stand, it's a barely average crop of keepers with an incredibly blurred vision. I can't tell if this team is trying to find a way into the playoffs or enact a youth movement. And if they're doing both, it's incredibly rare that plan actually results in a winning season. I've preached it from the inception of the league. You need to have a clear-cut identity in order to operate through the DBL successfully, whether that's with the mindset of tanking or the mindset of contending. Let's take a look at his keepers. Starting off with Donovan Mitchell, there's no doubt about it that he's an excellent keeper. He's still relatively young at 27 years old, and there's time to continue expanding his game even further, which is enticing because he's already a proven NBA star. However, as my co-host explained on the podcast during one of our episodes, you're probably not in great shape if Mitchell is your third or fourth best player, and he happens to be the McLovins' #1 option. 27 fantasy points per game is no joke at all, but I've been critical of Spida in fantasy for a while for never really reaching the heights of his peers. It's one of those cases to me where he happens to be an incredible NBA player, but just not quite as dominant in fantasy. Of course, he scored 71 points last year and added 11 boards for a 77 fantasy point outburst, so we know he's capable of monster stat lines, but to cement him as the protagonist of your game plan could be problematic considering he's never eclipsed that 27 fantasy point average before, with last season easily being his best run yet. I just don't think he'll ever be a 30 fantasy point guy, which is kind of disappointing given his status and skill. There's no question that he's an immensely talented keeper, but if Maryland finally decides to rebuild, I'm not sure it's worth it to have him stick around for the ride. I know I seemed a bit severe with my analysis of Mitchell, but he's far and wide an awesome keeper to obtain. The 7 remaining players have their red flags and drawbacks, but not without their high points either. Mitchell's former teammate in Rudy Gobert is a finals MVP in this league and has remained a steady source of fantasy points for years, but the move to Minnesota had to have Josh concerned. While he still put up 27 fantasy points per game, that was a steep decline from the season prior where he averaged a whopping 35. Playing next to Towns and being very limited offensively has certainly cut into his production, so I wouldn't be shocked if he trended downwards once again, falling to 26 or 25 fantasy points. There's still hope that he could match last year's output or even increase it, but after the way things went down last season and clocking Kyle Anderson in the face during an actual game, his time is ticking as a valuable asset. Sliding over to Zach LaVine, I've always loved his game and smooth jump shot, but it's hard to decipher what to exactly make of him these days. 3 seasons ago now, he was electrifying, putting up an all-around stat line of 27, 5, and 5, but ever since DeRozan moved to the Windy City, LaVine has still been a dependable option, however dipping to 23 fantasy points the past 2 years. That's adequate, but he's unfortunately been inconsistent, which has made it challenging to believe in him. Last year seemed to be an atrocious season during the first half of the schedule, but luckily he went berserk in the second stretch of the campaign, showcasing why he's still an intriguing commodity. It only wound up resulting in that 23 fantasy points per game finish, but there's still potential for him to bump that back up to 25. He's also an SG/SF let's try that again. He's also an SG/SF eligible player, which comes in handy during the season, but as long as he's the second option to DeRozan, his days may be numbered as an unwavering supplement of fantasy points. Another SG/SF eligible player, God, I was shaking saying that again, is Paul George, who the McLovins traded a second, third, and fourth for this past offseason. This is one of those moves that just confuses me about the direction of Maryland's team. Josh definitely made it seem like he was at least going to complete a soft reboot of sorts after bringing in guys like Tyler Hero, Jabari Smith Jr., and Jaden Ivey, but then did a 180 and traded for old veterans who are surely past their prime. Paul George is still a more than capable fantasy companion, but I've actually been kind of out on him for the past several years since he's so damn injury prone therefore unable to provide a consistent percentage of points. So not only do I think inserting him in as one of your 8 keepers is an unflattering choice for any team in the DBL, Josh also overpaid for him in my approximation because I only think he's worth like a second based on his inability to suit up for most of the schedule. When he has actually played the past 4 seasons, he's averaged somewhere around 26 fantasy points, which is extremely beneficial, but he'll be approaching the age of 34 this year, so if his body miraculously manages to not give out this time around, it might be his production, which I could see dipping to like 24 fantasy points. I still like him as a player. I think he's a decent 7th or 8th keeper for a contender like the Stars or the Magoos, but I wouldn't be thrilled about them having him either. He's kind of solidified himself as a high draft pick type of player at this point of his career, and although he'll net some big games for Maryland, his incorporation with the McLovins doesn't really make a lick of sense. Capella also manages to be a valid addition to any team, but there's been a growing concern with him over the past 3 years. In 2021, Clint averaged a massive 33 fantasy points per game, but in the 2 seasons since hasn't been able to get past 26. While that's obviously still a strong amount, he isn't what he once was, and his minutes have decreased to the point where he basically splits time with Okongwu. It's only a matter of time before Okongwu actually eclipses him as a starter and in terms of workload, but if Capella winds up getting traded as rumors have indicated, he could be even better than what we've seen the past couple of years. Unfortunately, as long as he remains in this situation in Atlanta, he may wind up falling off severely to around 22 or 23 fantasy points once Okongwu finally wins over the front office. But let's talk about the 2 sophomores Josh decided to roll with in Jabari Smith Jr. and Jaden Ivey. Look, if he's actually rebuilding, these are great young inclusions to sign off on, but as you can see with all the people I've talked about thus far, they make Jabari and Jaden feel absurdly out of place on this roster. Don't get me wrong, there's a chance they can both be surprisingly helpful additions in just their second seasons, but more likely than not, neither of them are going to be averaging over 22 fantasy points a game this year. They both had rocky rookie campaigns, but flashed some exciting potential, making way for the 2 of them to become future stars. But from a fantasy perspective, I wouldn't be surprised if they both only averaged 19 per game. That's not really going to do anything for Maryland in the event they're trying to compete this season, and if they want to develop these youthful projects, I can't see why they're surrounded by old guys that don't have a lot left in the tank. Like I said, they may very well take some bigger than expected leaps in 2024, but I don't think it's going to be enough to actually help the McLovins' chances of making the playoffs. Finally, let's address the elephant in the room. Hello, sir. How are you? He didn't understand me because he's an elephant and there's not actually one there. Chris Paul. I'm surprised this trade didn't invoke anger the way the Jimmy Butler deal did. Obviously, it was a much less expensive deal and Josh has been in the league for years, but in terms of what the value is that he was receiving, a 3rd rounder for Chris Paul is probably highway robbery. He was not himself last year, averaging a still solidly respectable 24 fantasy points, but was injured most of the campaign and never really performed even close to the way he did a season prior when he was an All-NBA guard at 29 fantasy points per game. I don't want to necessarily count CP3 out when I did that after he got traded from Houston and went on to have some of the best seasons of his career, but he's 38, clearly regressed from the point he was at a year ago, can't stay healthy, and worse than anything, is going to be playing on the Warriors behind who is widely considered the best point guard in the NBA, if not all time. Is there still a chance he can put up numbers sustainable enough to be rostered on a dynasty team? Sure, but we're talking about like 21, 22 fantasy points absolute max, with the more likely outcome being like 19 fantasy points since his workload will probably be capped. What the hell is he doing on the Maryland McLovins entering season 5? I don't believe he's a keeper anymore, which sucks because it was absolutely not that long ago that he was averaging 29, 30 fantasy points, but you gotta read the room and understand, even if he's as good as last year, the days of him being an elite fantasy player are over. Plus, in Maryland's case, you have a 20-year-old Jabari Smith on your roster, and unless everything goes conveniently perfect for this season, won't even be close to contending. So why mix that in with a 38-year-old Chris Paul? It's a very confounding structure that the McLovins currently have in place. In conclusion, these keepers aren't mind-numbingly awful, and in fact have a reasonable chance to convey themselves as a respectable batch of ballers, but when you compare them with the rest of the DBL, each manager and member is getting smarter and more strategic with their talent every year, making Maryland's core one of the least intimidating the league has to offer. There's just too many injury-riddled players, declining production risks, and a mix of philosophies in the locker room that can't help the McLovins understand if they're competing or tanking. Josh usually finds a way to figure it all out, but with utilizing these men as your top pieces, it's going to be tough to land a playoff spot. If you were already confused by Josh's intersecting paths, then buckle up for his draft. That might not be really fair to say, as by the looks of it, his selections all paint the picture of a manager who's finally decided to head towards a reimagined infrastructure. But in the context of most of his keepers, these concepts are battling each other for which way the front office should handle business. As far as Maryland's draft actually goes, though, I think this is a pretty terrific outcome if they truly plan on rebuilding. With the 5th pick, they selected Brandon Miller, who was the 2nd overall pick in the NBA draft and could already slot in as the 2nd option for the Hornets. But there's concerns to be had as well, because I don't know if anyone's paid attention to the Hornets pretty much at any point ever, but they're kind of a dumpster fire. He should have a pretty short leash, but at the same time, being drafted by an organization that has historically botched their selections for years makes you wonder, especially since Miller was taken over Scoot Henderson. Now, I think that he can be very good, but I don't have much faith in him producing great numbers at all for this season. He looked pretty awful in the Summer League, and I don't know if he's truly got the confidence to come back hungrier when he's in the middle of terrible shooting slumps. Like, I could really see him taking a backseat to Terry Rozier and Gordon Hayward if his shot's not falling. When you also add in Charlotte's other options across the board, such as LaMelo, Miles Bridges, Mark Williams, and PJ Washington, it might be difficult for Miller to get into a consistent flow. But still, the upside's there, and he can wind up in the running for Rookie of the Year when it's all said and done, but I have a hard time believing the guy that said Paul George is the greatest player of all time is going to be a fantastic rookie, or star player in general. I expect the Jalen Green or Jabari Smith Jr. type of rookie campaign. 3 picks later, Josh chose Robert Williams, and unfortunately, this is my least favorite pick of his. It's weird, I'm not quite sure what to think of him anymore. A year ago at this time, even if he was already pretty injury prone, he averaged 28 fantasy points and was looking to be an extremely desirable fantasy player. Missing half the season was just supposed to be a minor speed bump, but when he came back, he was a shell of his former self, averaging just 20 fantasy points. Now, I don't know, I know he was on a minutes restriction and he had to get back into game shape, and the C's didn't want to mess up the flow of what they had going with Horford in the lineup, but even in limited minutes the year prior, he was putting up impressive numbers. Last year's decline was widely concerning to me, and while he's still young, he's now officially operating as a backup behind DeAndre Ayton in Portland. Unless he's traded to a location like Dallas or somewhere else he'd obviously be starting, I would not be very ecstatic about him in his situation right now. There's a chance he could still be fantasy relevant in limited minutes as seen before, but a first round pick is pretty expensive for a guy whose stock could be in serious jeopardy. Josh's last 3 picks all fell in the second round, which gave him ample room to choose some of the best remaining players. With the 14th pick, he took Amen Thompson, which is an incredible choice for a rebuilding ball club that doesn't give a fuck about their record for the upcoming season. Look, if Fred VanVleet wasn't signed, I'd be all over this, especially with KPJ suspended for being a piece of shit. I really believe in his prospects for the future, but unluckily this season, I'd imagine Freddie is getting the bulk of the playtime after receiving that fat contract. What if he plays the 2? Oh, so they can move Jalen Green to the 3 and not play Dylan Brooks after his crazy-ass contract? It's just not the best situation for him for maybe the next 2 years, so if Josh is willing to be patient, I think it'll pay off tremendously. But we all know how hard it is to stay committed to someone who's not really providing any fantasy points for us in the moment, and with Maryland's incompatible roster blend, I'm not sure if I see this going too well for him. Alas, it's hard to pass on the 4th pick at number 14 if your intention is to tank, so I still really like this selection. With his next pick, Josh chose Miles Bridges, clearly demonstrating his hatred for women and misogynistic worldview. Realistically, though, I think any number of us would probably take on Bridges' uncomfortable history since his last season playing basketball led to 25 fantasy points a night. Look, we're not supporting this guy, but we obviously all want to win, and if there's a chance that the woman beater could sniff that type of production again, you kinda have to take it. He is suspended for the first 10 games, 15 less than Ja Morant, fuck off, and there's no guarantee he's going to be as good as he was 2 years ago or even get a ton of playtime, but if he still winds up averaging like 21 fantasy points, I'd say this was a pretty successful selection, but also you have to kind of take into consideration that he's on the Hornets and he's Miles Bridges, and that's enough to make you worry. Finally, Josh was able to snag Amen's twin in Asar, Dinosaur, I don't know. I'm surprised he fell to the 19th spot though, to be honest with you. I think long term, Amen will be better, but Asar is locked into a starting role on a bad Pistons team with a chance to contribute in multiple categories. I don't know if he'll be a must-own type of player for the season, but I can see him flashing his potential while putting up around 17 fantasy points. In the end, I think this is a damn good draft. If we're talking about the season ahead, and if Josh is looking for immediate output, this could wind up disastrous, as all of these players are either rookies, not starting, or like to assault women in their free time. But if we're talking about the bigger picture and the general outlook of these selections, this is the type of board that could honestly wind up in the conversation for best draft. I like this a lot if the McLovins stand by their decisions and actually follow through with identity realignment, but if not, they better at least trade these guys for foundational pieces, or else this draft could be a complete waste and colossal failure. The moral of the story with Maryland is what I've preached throughout their entire section of the video. They need to figure out what they're doing and not change their mind 3 weeks in. Even if that's going for it and trying to make the playoffs, which I don't really recommend, I'd rather see that than a half-assed rebuild or a lackluster attempt at trying to win. You need to put all of your faith into one side, and when the going gets tough, keep grinding through the storm, because it's only going to get harder if you continuously flip-flop through your beliefs. I may seem a bit cruel in my analysis of the McLovins, but it's only because I believe in Josh as a manager, who's already got a DBL title under his name. With some fine-tuning, this franchise could get back on track, but even if Josh continues with a conflicted mindset, mindset all year, there's still a possibility Maryland finds themselves in the postseason, somehow, some way. I don't think that's very likely at all, and it's, only got a tiny percentage of actually happening, but Josh still has a skilled crowd of fantasy performers in his corner. But with how deep the rest of the teams are and devoted other league members are to actually contending, I don't really see a universe where the McLovins escape the lottery. From here on out, the rankings of the next 8 teams are basically an unsolvable puzzle, as it was painstakingly challenging to predict who would finish where. My hottest take this video, however, has to be my positioning of the Las Vegas Whales missing the playoffs with what I predict to be a sub-500 record. This opinion has the opportunity to age like absolute shit and make me look like the biggest idiot that's ever lived, but I truly believe this isn't going to be the return to greatness that both James and fellow league members assume it to be. Look, James is a former MVP, an all-fantasy alum in the DBL who's had an impressive run of intimidation over teams for the past 2 to 3 years, but as we all know, James controversially decided to tank only a few weeks into Season 4 when he didn't like what he was seeing out of his ball club, prompting him to not set his lineup for the remainder of the schedule. We're all cool with the notion of tanking, but the controversy stemmed from what most would consider the disingenuous approach of him literally not ever changing his lineup or honoring the integrity of the league. Tanking is fair when you trade away your best players for youthful additions and a slew of picks, or even not picking people up off the wire to improve your team for the season is entirely understandable, but when you don't even adjust your lineup, throw in the towel, and say see you next year, it's a little unceremonious to what we expect out of our competitors. All of us in the league acknowledge why he wound up going down this path, as Victor Wembanyama was on the horizon, and it wasn't shaping up to be the proudest season of the Whales' tenure, so it makes sense to strike and sacrifice a year of contending to fulfill the prophecy of obtaining one of the most highly touted prospects of all time, but it rubbed a bit of us the wrong way, as we all wish we quote-unquote cheated to acquire him too. But look, according to the rules in Article B, subsection 17 of the DBL, there was absolutely nothing that stated it was illegal or couldn't be done. It may have been considered immoral or frowned upon, but it was technically a practice that was truthfully allowed. Besides, we've seen teams like Sam and Ish not set their lineups or give any effort to their organizations year in and year out, so what would the difference really be if James was doing it intentionally instead? He paid his buy-in and was free to do whatever he wanted with his team because there hadn't been a basis intact or discussion of consequences for what would happen if these actions were actually carried out. Until now. As the commissioner, I couldn't in good faith penalize the Whales or anyone for their ideologies in Season 4, but after the year ended, I made it clear that tanking egregiously and unfairly from this point forward would result in fines and or loss of first-round draft picks. So although some of us were a little frustrated with Las Vegas' principles, we have to thank them for allowing the groundwork to be built to discontinue these practices forever. It's honestly historic and adds to the rich history the DBL exercises. So if you're ever at a party and want to impress strangers with a tidbit of history, just mention the James Taylor rule that was effectively put into place in May of 2023. Now that I got all of that out of the way and James completed his vision by securing Wemby, I just don't think he's actually going to be the savior to help lead this team to the promised land. There's no doubt about it that the Whales have an onslaught of productive fantasy benefactors, but I honestly think last season may have been one of the final chances that James had to significantly compete with the roster he has in place. He's employed this team for 4 seasons straight, with very little changes being made to its core. Although many of them will still act as terrific scorers for Vegas, a lot of them are destined to regress and not supply the services that we've been accustomed to as accomplished stars. Beginning with Harden, it couldn't be any more clear. I said the same thing last year, and at this point, we're just waiting for the inevitable downfall of the beard. Can he still be a top-tier fantasy talent at 19 points, 5 rebounds, and 9 assists per game? Unquestionably, but at 34 years old and inefficient shooting splits, we may finally be looking at Harden dip below 30 fantasy points per game, which hasn't happened since like 2014. He's either going to continue on with a gradual decline or turn into current-day Blake Griffin, which either way isn't going to be an ideal scenario for the Whales, who've been spoiled by an average of about 36 fantasy points since the unveiling of the DBL.
Never mind the whole fact that the dude might be sitting out until he gets traded from Philly. It's going to be a hard pill to swallow for James.
Bam Adebayo might be the only keeper in Vegas that I don't have any issues with. It's very possible that he's not going to improve any more from what he's already brought to the table, but that's not really a hindrance when he's only 26 and is able to continuously provide 29 to 30 fantasy points a night. Lillard, on the other hand, is a tricky one because, like Harden, he's approaching his mid-30s and will be sharing the rock with actual all-star level help, which may see some of his counting stats be taken away. But at the same time, Dame really hasn't shown any signs of slowing down in terms of his on-court performance, only that he's been kind of ransacked by injuries the past few years. I still expect Lillard to average somewhere between 28 to 30 fantasy points, which is of course excellent company to be a part of, but we could be dealing with a minor drop in statistics as well as a slice of missed games. Towns is the only newcomer to the Whales when talking about their keepers, a guy that James traded for at the tail end of last season, and I've got to give credit where credit is due. Not only is he a fantastic player to add to your core, but all he gave up were unstable role players in the acquisition. He didn't even have to give up any picks and managed to receive a second rounder alongside Towns too. So that's amazing work, but I still have some beef with Cat. He's officially injury prone, his stats dramatically decreased with the attainment of Rudy Gobert, and it's as clear as day that Ant-Man is taking over as the go-to guy for the Wolves. Towns can still be an extremely fruitful second option and fantasy asset, averaging 27 fantasy points in Season 4, but I'm still a little worried that drops again. He plummeted 6 whole fantasy points from the prior year, and while there's still room for him to rise back up to 29 or so a game, you'd have to imagine he stays put or drops again to like 26. I like Towns as a player, but the days where we'd consider him a potential superstar are over. This is still a phenomenal pickup for the Whales, but you can no longer expect the Cat from 2 years ago. Even if I've been a bit negative with these keepers so far, they're still pretty damn formidable. Unluckily for James though, I start to find even more flaws as we get into the second half of his core. Bradley Beal is obviously a great player and scoring threat, but he averaged 24 and 23 fantasy points the past 2 seasons, as well as 40 and 50 games played during those campaigns. So not only is he injury prone as of late, but his exclusive ability to score the rock and add purposeful minutes to a fantasy club has taken a noticeable step back. I mean, this was on the can't even make the play in Wizards the past 2 years, so now touching down in Phoenix as the third option behind a red-hot Devin Booker and all-time great in Kevin Durant, I have a hard time believing he doesn't finish somewhere in the 22 to 23 fantasy point range. That's still a solid enough result, but for someone that twice averaged over 30 points per game and who I'd consider the Whales' 5th best player is kinda worrisome. With the injuries we've come to expect from KD as well as the seemingly limited depth on the Suns, Beal could be in line for 24 plus again, especially if he actually takes over point guard duties as D-Book alluded to, but I reckon I'm out on Beal as a consistent option moving forward. That takes us to Jakob Poeltl, who I'm a fan of and believe is an underrated player and fantasy commodity, but at the same time, I'm not big on his situation or dynasty stock. He averaged 24 fantasy points last year, which is definitely respectable, and he seemed to shine further in Toronto than he even did in San Antonio, but I don't know. There's a lot of front court depth, and the Raptors have a new coach, so I'm a little reserved regarding his output. I'm expecting a drop off between 1 to 2 fantasy points, which still makes him rosterable, but maybe not someone you put all of your faith into. Getting to James' final 2 keepers, I can officially say that I don't like MPJ or John Collins at all. Look, MPJ is an NBA champion and is still quite young, but unless he takes over a team as the go-to first option, I don't see him being very effective. Maybe that's strange to say when it seemed like the Whales were going to be relishing in his abilities just a few seasons ago, but between his injury history and lackluster production of only 18 fantasy points last year, I don't see how he's going to do any better between Jokic and Murray being the alpha males of the team. With Collins, this guy's had a roller coaster fantasy tenure in the DBL. He's a 2-time All-Star, once averaged 32 fantasy points per game, and seemed like a safe bet to be a must-own player for years to come. But at the same time, his scoring and counting stats continue to dwindle off over the next handful of seasons to the point he practically seemed like a safe bet to be dropped in our league. He too averaged 18 fantasy points, and he's getting a fresh start in Utah. But unless the Jazz weirdly unlock him the way they did with Markkanen, I think this situation may be even less beneficial for him. I think he's going to average 17 to 19 fantasy points, which may only make him one of the best streaming options on the wire year-round. Once again with the Whales, this collaboration of names looks good on paper, but I don't think these keepers are going to deliver the numbers the mainstream appeal of them may suggest. There's still going to be an assortment of them that go off for all 19 weeks of the regular season, but keeping John Collins and Michael Porter Jr. again over guys like Jalen Williams or whoever else was available on the market may cause an internal explosion within the Vegas locker room. Most of this team is now composed of older and soon-to-be washed-up players that are injury-prone and past their primes, so I'm not too keen on this list of athletes entering Season 5. Unfortunately for James, I personally think it gets even worse from the standpoint of his draft. No matter what, the Whales are set up for life with the arrival of Wemby, so based off of the acquisition of him alone, nothing else really matters. He should average somewhere around 20 points, 9 rebounds, and 2 blocks a game for something along the lines of 26 or 27 fantasy points. But like I previously mentioned, I don't think Wembanyama is going to carry James to the promised land based on the rest of his core and the draft selections that were made. At the end of the second round, the Whales decided to go with Tobias Harris, and I'm very, very lukewarm on him. He only averaged 19 fantasy points last season, which could mean he's on the decline, and it's not like he was an excellent option before that either, but if Harden's out of the picture, he should get some more scoring opportunities and chances at raising his average a little bit, but I don't see it being any higher than like 21 fantasy points. And you know what? That's not bad for the last pick in the second round, but it's no promise, and there were probably better names remaining than 31-year-old Crumble Cookie. Right after, Vegas went with Shaden Sharp, who I do think could be a pretty electrifying player at some point, but I don't know when that's going to be or how impactful he'll be in his current situation. I already expressed this concern with Scoot, but at least Scoot enters the year as the franchise's central building block. Put Anthony Simons next to him, does that mean Shaden plays the 3 or comes off the bench? Forget the fact that Jeremy Grant and DeAndre Ayton are looking to get theirs too. I just don't really see how Sharp could average more than 17 fantasy points this year, as I'm realistically expecting somewhere between 14 and 17. I don't think he's a bad investment to take a chance on, but for someone like James who probably expects to be contending, this pick kind of comes out of left field for me. I'm assuming he'll be off the team within a month. As for Dennis Schroeder, I don't see the vision either. I understand that he was phenomenal in the FIBA World Cup, winning the gold and being named the tournament's MVP, but I'm not really buying the notion of that translating over to the NBA. He's entering his 11th season in the league and only averaged 14 fantasy points last year. Sure, he's in a new scenario in Toronto and will be the starting point guard, but he's practically in a new scenario every season at this point, and nothing's ever changed. The most fantasy points he's ever averaged since the DBL began was 18. So even if he actually gets back to that mark, that's a borderline weekly pickup when you've got someone in your IR. I know Gary isn't going to like that slander on Dennis either, but I have to call it how I see it. With his final pick, James secured Wemby's teammate from Mets 92 in Bill Cosby. I don't really know much about him. I'm sure he's got some raw potential that can make him an intriguing player to keep an eye on, but I'm also not a big fan of this choice. I get that it's the 5th round and it's smart to take a flyer on these kinds of players at this point, but he doesn't really mesh with the Whales game plan, and there's no real indication that he'll be starting or getting a lot of minutes. You've got Corey Kispert, Denny Avdia, Gallo, and Kyle Kuzma taking up forward spots, so while I definitely think he's going to get a good amount of time on what's sure to be a really bad Wizards team, I don't think it's actually going to impart many fantasy points for the Whales, which means this isn't a very splendiferous pick. All in all, that's my take on Las Vegas. It may not be a popular prediction, but I just feel like there's a lot working against James at this particular point. You've got a lot of injury-prone players, James Harden who may be sitting out the entire season, older stars who are past their primes, and a few guys who don't really have any business being keepers anymore. Throw in his underwhelming draft selections not named Victor Wembanyama, James is really going to have to improve his team through trades and waiver wire acquisitions to be a 5 or 6 seed at best. We already know James doesn't really get on the phone to talk trades or make deals, as evidenced by his loss of Jalen Williams in the offseason, so I find it kind of hard to believe that in a league full of eager competitors, the Whales would still make the playoffs after all the potential issues I just summarized. Of course, I could be completely out of my mind. In theory and on paper, Las Vegas is still an absolutely fearsome foe with a lot of fantasy talent in the books. Adding the Spurs' generational rookie to that rotation certainly gives him wiggle room to not only lock in a playoff spot, but enter him into the territory of championship aspirations. Plus, he's usually very resourceful and clever when it comes to nabbing guys off the wire, so he's got that working in his favor. But in my estimation, a lot looks like it could go terribly wrong for the Whales, and as I already implied, it's going to be a challenging road for them to finish as a top 6 team. The last team to miss the playoffs, in my opinion, is going to be the New York Gems. I know I've doubted Anthony before, only to be proven vastly wrong, but with the level of competition consistently rising, I feel like everything would have to go seamlessly in order for Anthony to be a guaranteed contender. Last year was an impressive one, as the Gems wound up finishing in 4th after I and many others foresaw New York being one of the worst teams in the league. Ant silenced the haters by being a tough matchup for league members week in and week out, filling his roster up with fringe all-star candidates and trading for the services of Jalen Brunson and Nick Claxton, who both happen to have some of the biggest breakouts of 2023. But even with how well his team truly performed, and how it seems like I was embarrassingly wrong about his dead last finish, the Gems should also consider themselves unusually lucky. Ant won 3 matchups due to Sam and James not setting their lineups against him last year, Cam redirected the goals of his team to shoot for the lottery instead of contend, and a few of his players known for constantly being sidelined actually managed to suit up for almost all of their games. Subtract those convenient scenarios from the picture, and the Gems probably wind up with a 9th place finish. I don't mean to take away from the immaculate achievements accomplished by this ball club, but when painting the picture of who I think is not playing in the postseason come 2024, these are some of the reasons why. That's not to say these keepers aren't actually pretty damn good. I just think the DBL is so tough now, just like the NBA, because you look around and there's legitimate talent everywhere, which makes it so hard to judge everyone's rosters. But starting with Trae Young, there isn't anything to criticize. He's the Gems franchise cornerstone and has been a 30 fantasy point caliber player ever since the league initiated. The only question mark I have with Trae is if we've already seen his ceiling or if he can still pump those numbers up. Either way, having your peak be this good already and for the long term is an astounding triumph. Let's next talk about Scottie Barnes, Williams, who had an underwhelming second year in the league, I still have big expectations and high hopes for the former Rookie of the Year. The NBA fandom is an insanely reactionary oasis that probably has a lot of people thinking that maybe Scottie isn't that good. And look, maybe he isn't. Maybe he's a system player. Maybe he's the next Tyreke Evans, or maybe he's going to be a perennial all-star. It certainly seems like the Raptors are leaning towards making him the focal point of their future, so I still have faith he's going to be an enthralling asset, but we do need to see him improve and at least reach the 24 fantasy point plateau this season. Last year, New York took a swing on Nick Claxton that looks to have been one of the best trades in recent memory. After obtaining Clax, he quickly garnered 2 DBL Player of the Week awards and showcased why he is going to mirror Jarrett Allen's trajectory and possibly even surpass it. Nearly 28 fantasy points on under 30 minutes, under 10 rebounds, and over 2 blocks. If he still has more to prove, we could be looking at prime Gobert stat lines, averaging something like 15 points, 11 rebounds, and 3 blocks a game on elite efficiency, might have him sneaking up on 40 fantasy points a game. I don't know if he can quite reach that level or if we've already seen the best out of him, but either way, the Gems secured a certified fantasy star. The other stud they received via trade was Jalen Brunson, who was nothing short of miraculous for the Knicks. 25 fantasy points borders on elite territory, but I guess I just wonder if he can break through and elevate his game to even greater heights. I thought what we saw in the Mavs was practically his ceiling, so I don't want to double down and say that this performance last year was also probably the best we've seen from him, but it's something worth thinking about. He might overtake Randall as the unadulterated first option, but even if he remains at the same level, we're talking about a likely all-star at 25 a game. So far, so good. I don't have any issues with these guys, and a few of them I expect big-time production out of. However, the duo of big men I'm about to discuss is where I start to find cracks in the Gems blueprint. Porzingis was simply phenomenal last season. I cannot dispute that in any way. I can't even say, well, he'd be so much more meaningful to the Gems if he actually played, because the fucker actually played 65 games, the most since his sophomore year. He averaged over 30 fantasy points and was easily the best player on the Wizards. But can we really rely on him to play 65 plus games again? Even at 65, he's missing like a fifth of the season, which is a good chunk of games, albeit still relatively healthy. To me, one season doesn't change everything. It's the reverse of the reactionary senses that I was talking about with Scottie. One sophomore slump that still saw him at 22 fantasy points a game isn't going to make me think he's done for, and KP having one pretty healthy campaign isn't going to make me assume he's playing 70 plus games the rest of his career. Before last season, it was 5 years in a row he hadn't played 60 games, and 4 of them were 51 or less. When you also remember that he's shifting gears from the first option to the third option behind solidified stars in Tatum and Brown, potentially even fourth option if Holiday gets more usage than him, he's bound for a reduction across the board. Keep in mind Horford should still carve out a solid role, and Robert Williams is also a big-time threat for minutes. Okay, I didn't remove that from my notes here. Obviously, he's not on the Celtics anymore, so take that out of the picture, but Horford is still there, so either way with Porzingis, I think those 30 FPs a game are dropping to around 25, which again, that's a lot, but when you factor in a likely surplus of missed games, I still can't fully back him. As for JJJ, look, he's also pretty injury prone, but managed to return to the Grizzlies last season and flourished ever since. He was an all-star, won the DPOY, and averaged a robust 26 fantasy points a night. That was a huge jump from the prior year where he averaged a measly 20 and hadn't really flashed a consistent fantasy game. Alas, he still averaged a career high in points, rebounds, and blocks at only 23 years old. But I'm just not sold on his ability to stay on the court. It's still a concern as far as I'm concerned, so he'll need to play at least 65 games again to prove that he can be relied on. When it comes to his fantasy production, I also want to see more out of him in rebounding the basketball. 6.8 was a giant leap considering the dude went multiple years averaging 4, so I'm happy to see that shoot up, but again, he's a 7-footer that still has trouble grabbing 7 boards a game. Can he raise those board-nabbing abilities in a second straight year, or is he going to hover around 6 for the rest of his career? It's also worth noting that Ja will miss a decent chunk of the season. Is this going to hurt Tripp's ability to get open looks and reduce his efficiency as the 1B, or is he going to develop into a 20-point per game scorer with Ja Wick sidelined? At the end of the day, what he can do on the defensive end with his rim protecting ability is nearly unmatched in the NBA, and those 3 blocks a game make his upside even more mouthwatering. Just imagine if he actually got double-doubles. Jaren could be like another big on the Gems that has a chance to flirt with 40 fantasy points, but I'm just not sure his rebounding will ever really be there, and I need to see that he can actually play most of the schedule before I proclaim him as a bona fide fantasy star. Now comes the part of Ant's overview that will serve as the most divisive subject of the entire video, Zion Williamson. Look, we certainly can't question Zion's talent and immense upside as a player. When he has participated out there, he's shown how incredible he can be, and of course at such a young age too, paving way for him to continue to get even better and cement himself as a legend. But in order to do that, The man's gotta play. Out of 328 potential regular season games throughout his 4-year span in the NBA, Zion has played a depressing 114 of them, meaning he's only played 31% of his entire career. The dude has basically only played in 1 out of 4 seasons, which is extremely discouraging. I'm in no way, shape, or form questioning his skill, I'm just questioning whether or not he can actually utilize it, because to me, I think he'd be speaking with blind ambition to say he's going to be healthy and dominate for years to come. I just presented the facts, like he's only had 1 healthy campaign thus far. Of course, things can change. He can play all 82 games and annihilate the fantasy playing field day in and day out, but assuming he'd actually be present for most of the schedule would be taking a leap of faith. Even if he does play every single game, he's got to do that for the next season, the season after that, and the season after that to justify the monstrous haul the Gems packaged away in return. It's not that I mind the gamble on Zion, because we've seen players like Embiid or Steph Curry become all-time greats after the start of their careers seemed disastrous with the ill-fated injury bug, but mortgaging the rest of your available first-round picks and trading away your capacity to rebuild makes for a giant signal of distress. If it works out, amazing, all-time trade by the Gems, but even if it does, it's hard for me to really see it classifying New York as a top-tier contender for the foreseeable future. Zion has averaged 30 fantasy points just as the greats in this league do, but he hasn't reached the mid-30s mark, which would group him alongside the best of the best in the DBL. Maybe he hasn't yet because he never will, but more likely than not, it's because he hasn't played enough to actually show what he's capable of. In my estimation, Ant could have gotten this deal done for a single first-rounder. It'd be damn near a win if Zion managed to play 50 games this season, though, and obviously the potential to be amazing is there, but with his continuous seat on the bench, uninspired aggression, and porn addiction of which I can relate, he's gonna need to prove it, and then whatever you think of that proof, multiply it by 10. Last up on the menu for the Gems is the all-time rookie leader in three-pointers for a season, Keegan Murray. Keegs was an active participant in the Kings' success last year, playing a pivotal role for a playoff team that went to 7 games with the reigning champs. He was a fantastic role player for the Kings, but can he become more? I do think that the potential is there. Maybe even as early as this year, he could put up 18 to 19 points a game, but as far as fantasy goes, I don't see him being much of a threat. Last year, he averaged 12 points, 4 rebounds, and 15 fantasy points, which is fine since he was a rookie and had to battle Fox and Sabonis for meaningful production, but I don't really see his fantasy output doing much for New York in Season 5. He'll probably be somewhere along the lines of 16 points, 5 rebounds, and like 17 to 18 fantasy points, which is going to be a hard realization for the Gems to take in if they plan on going all the way. I don't necessarily mind this keeper because I do see some kind of all-star potential down the road, but based on the amount of assets that were given up for Zion and how New York has retooled themselves to be a playoff competitor, I probably would have preferred a stronger fantasy contributor for this season alone. But all in all, I do think that this is a valid list of guys. They're not perfect by any means, between some of the overwhelming injury concerns, high probability on younger guys like Keegan Murray and Scotty Barnes not being of illustrious assistance this year, and hypothesizing that some of these pieces may have already reached their ceiling, but there's an obvious amount of fantasy star power surrounding the Gems. There's a lot of impactful players in this group that can still take their games to another level, and if New York can stay healthy, in theory we may be looking at some of the best keepers in the league. However, the issues that I touched on are prevalent enough to cloud my judgment from giving a heftier stamp of approval, especially when you look around the DBL to see stacked rosters everywhere. I'm of sound belief that Ant really needed to ace his draft if he wanted to be in playoff contention, but unfortunately, I think he took on a pretty below average collection of names. He didn't draft until the 3rd round, which will always put managers in a more inopportune position. However, that being said, I think he got a credible component in Ivica Zubac with the 27th pick. This is a dude that averaged 22 fantasy points last year and put up a 67-point fantasy masterclass too. I expect this season to play out similarly for him, concluding in 21 or 22 fantasy points a night. I don't know why he fell this far in the draft, but he should serve as a solid steal for the Gems. Next though, Ant took Quentin Grimes, and I'm not feeling this one at all. I'm a Knicks fan, and I think Grimes is a really nice NBA role player, but in the DBL he averaged 13 fantasy points last year. Why would that change now? He's still playing the same positions as Brunson, Quickly, Hart, and Barrett, not to mention Dante DiVincenzo's there too, so unless he is traded to a place where he can be of higher ranking in the pecking order, Grimes is probably going to be dropped within a week or two of generic performances. Right after that, New York went with the only other guy that I think can be a beneficial fantasy accessory from their draft in Benedict Mathurin. He had a dull rookie season from a fantasy perspective, but still dropped nearly 17 points a night in a role off the bench. Now he should be starting and could low-key be the second option on the Pacers already, with a chance to put up over 20 a night. That might not mean it's going to translate over to the fantasy world though, as he'll likely be inefficient with an underwhelming all-around game that won't see him get many assists or rebounds, but I still think he'll be worth holding onto for the future if the Gems can be patient with his progress. I'm going to assume around 7 17 to 18 fantasy points a night, which doesn't make him very helpful for the time being, but could make him an intriguing option when looking forward. With their last two picks, New York opted for two rookies in Cam Whitmore and Keontae George. I admire the analysis of his scouting efforts, but these are big swings that have a very low chance of paying off for this season alone. If Ant was rebuilding, I'd be more content with these choices, but he's not, so he really needs guys that are going to come in and are confirmed to supply his team with fantasy points. These two aren't even confirmed to get minutes. I like them both, especially Cam Whitmore, but it's such a crowded rotation in Houston that even if he's good when he plays, that's only going to be like 10 minutes a night. And with Keontae, maybe he starts or carves out a sizable role in Utah, but as a rookie, you have to assume there's going to be a ton of trial and error with his performance. I don't see these guys being difference makers this year and would have to bet that they're off of the gems soon. To put it bluntly, I just don't think this was a very good draft. You never know, right? Those rookies and younger lads could pop off and all be worth rostering, but the likelihood of every single one of them being accompanied by fantasy-relevant stats and a lot of minutes is extremely low. Even with me liking the pick of Mathurin, I find the idea of him averaging over 19 fantasy points a bit hard to swallow. Although Zubac should be reliable, that's not going to be enough to take the Gems over the edge this year. When you remember the rest of the team has some considerable risk already in players like Zion, Porzingis, and Keegan Murray, I just can't quite label New York a playoff team for Season 5. I know they found a way in last year, but Cam isn't gunning for a lottery spot anymore, and Sam and Ish have both been replaced by managers who will probably make it a point to be much more competitive. I think it's certainly possible. Every year the Gems seem to make some noise by outperforming expectations and putting in more effort than a bulk of league members involved in the DBL, but all of his players are going to have to stay healthy, and his draft selections are going to need to be replaced by fantastic waiver wire pickups or sensibly assembled trades. Otherwise, it's going to be a rude awakening for New York, who pawned all of their first-round picks off for a guy who hasn't proved he can play in a majority of the schedule. Even if he does, they're pretty dry on draft capital now, so it's going to be hard to make trades to improve the team from a winning point of view. If other teams collapse and get screwed over by the injury bug, the Gems may find themselves knocking on the postseason door, but as it stands now, they'll be finishing in 7th. The first team I have making the playoffs and avoiding the lottery is GM Ish's replacement in Mike Rosansky, overseeing the Napa Valley Fighting Grapes. After 3 seasons, Ish retired to the tune of a 39-35 career record, garnering 2 all-dumbass selections and 1 last-place finish in the process. Although there were highs, such as being a 1-time assist leader and making the playoffs in 3 out of 4 seasons, Ish was almost as infamous as Sam for his lack of effort and hard-to-reach front office. Mike was brought in over the summer to overtake management duties, a 5-star recruit out of Rowan University, and has already made close to the same amount of impact as the former owner made in his entire time in the league. This included cleverly trading a future pick for a current pick this season so the Grapes would have enough draft selections to fill out their roster, as well as bringing in a young talent like Franz Wagner to replace a bottom-tier role player keeper and instill faith in future development. The same kind of notes can be reiterated here from the Pronghorn section. Mike has never managed in our league before and doesn't have much fantasy basketball experience. That's going to hurt him a little bit, but Napa Valley still has an in-his-prime Jokic that will probably average 50 fantasy points. Mike will naturally have some speed bumps as a first-year manager, but has already shown some strong interest in bettering his team. I've said every season that Ish has controlled this roster was that all he needed to do was put in a tiny amount of effort to be a contender. With Mike at the helm now, the Grapes are capable of bringing that hypothesis to fruition. When we look at his keepers, clearly Jokic is unreal and may finally average a triple-double this season. He's literally 2 great keepers in 1. The next area of interest to talk about is De'Aaron Fox, who received his first All-Star nod in the NBA last year and is still young enough to improve on those numbers for a considerable amount of time. While I still think Sabonis is the more ideal fantasy operator on the Kings, it's viable that Fox averages 28 points, 5 rebounds, and 6 assists. Markkanen was taken by Ish in the draft last season, and it was one of 2 things that he really did expertly in his final bow. Lauri averaged practically 30 fantasy points and put up 25 and 8 on delicious efficiency with the Jazz. I really like his game, but I am a little worried this was a bit of a fluke season. Not that Lauri is bad by any means. I mean, he was also a first-time NBA and DBL All-Star last year, but you can make the argument that he's just an empty stats bad team guy, although the Jazz were like the best team in the league for the first third of the season, but I don't know. I feel like he's a little hard to judge. His first 2 seasons with the Bulls showcased a 20 and 10 upside, but then he fell off a cliff and was relegated to a 4th option on the Cavs, finally making his way to Utah and officially breaking out. I think he will still be a very consistent and reliable fantasy player, but I can see his numbers falling a bit to 22 and 7, which will bring his 30 fantasy points closer to 25 or 26. Maybe he will build upon his fantastic campaign last season. That can certainly happen, but I just also wouldn't be surprised if his numbers dipped a tad. Julius Randle is another mold of player that's also kind of hard to dissect. He was the 1A for the Knicks last season, and as far as fantasy goes, he should still be the top dog in that department too, but I also have to imagine his numbers decrease. Brunson will probably not only get better, but at least be more of a focal point in the offense than he was last year, pushing Julius to the second option or at least the 1B now. Plus, there seems to be a pattern where Julius fluctuates in performance every year. First season with the Knicks was an average campaign, followed up by his breakout All-NBA year, a disappointing playoffs, an underwhelming and unmotivated average campaign again, back to All-NBA level play, disappointing playoffs, and now we're back at the start of a new season that suggests it'll be another down year. I don't know, as a Knicks fan, I gotta love Randle for bringing the city its only relevance over the past decade, but I can see him declining again to 22 points, 8 rebounds, and 3 assists, which is still gonna provide Mike with like 25 or so fantasy points, but I doubt he replicates an All-NBA season 2 years in a row. Vucevic is also extremely tough to rate. I mean, he's been one of the most consistent and durable fantasy options over the past 4 to 5 seasons, but he's turning 33 before the new year tips off, so it seems sooner rather than later that his production and stats are going to fall by the wayside. He's been averaging like 17 and 11 for the Bulls 3 years straight, 29 to 30 fantasy points. He's just been remarkable, really, but the Bulls are kind of directionless right now, and with his age and stuff, his stats may quietly dip, they may massively dip, or he's going to retain this level of dominance he's had on the DBL, but if he does, I think it's the last season we see him average over 28 fantasy points. Maybe not, but you gotta follow the signs in these cases, and the two-time champ may be closer to the end of fantasy relevance than we want to admit. I'm rooting for him though, because even if it's a small drop in stats, we're still looking at like 16 and 10 plus 3 to 4 assists a night. When it comes to Jrue Holiday, he's been one of the most consistent fantasy assets since our league's inauguration when he was on the Pelicans, continuously performing around the 24 to 25 fantasy point average with each season that passes. But with the move to Boston, he's probably the fourth option, which will cut into his fantasy numbers. Plus, he can be a bit of an injury risk and is now 33 as well. I'd still bank on him to be a trustworthy enough player, but a dip to 23 fantasy points or so should be expected considering the circumstances. On to Jonas Valanciunas. He's proven how elite he can be given the minutes as a former Finals MVP, but if his playtime stays under 25 minutes, that's just a disservice to any fantasy team. While he can still average an impressive 23 to 24 fantasy points in limited runs, you still want to see a guy like that get at least 30 minutes a game, which would bring him back to all DBL type consideration. But again, he's yet another candidate to put up reduced stat lines since last year saw a downturn in minutes and counting numbers. It's possible that trajectory continues. I think he's still getting 22 to 24 a night, but if he's getting a minor role on the Pelicans, that's obviously not someone you want to lock in for the near future anymore. Last up for Napa Valley comes his youngest addition to the central unit in Franz Wagner, the man he traded for in the offseason. While a second round pick may have been too much to pay for a guy that only averaged 19 fantasy points, we have to remember it was just his sophomore season. Many pundits believe he's due for a breakout campaign this year, and while I have some doubts about that with the logjam of youth stuffed into the rotation of Orlando, all wanting to prove themselves, he's clearly got the most potential to be a star outside of Banchero. He could improve to about 21 fantasy points, which would be a solid investment for the Grapes to take. While that doesn't make him necessarily a must-keep player for the current season, you hold on to young guys for what they could possibly become, and he has the chance to be a perennial all-star in the future. While I'm not in love with him for the time being, it's still a great choice to add him to your core as opposed to Mike's other options, which were like Klay Thompson and Kyle Lowry. In summary, these keepers are pretty damn good, but what puts them over the edge is Nikola Jokic. I have some fear that a lot of these guys regress in one way or another, as I went down the line and found that to be a possibility with 5 out of 8 players, but that obviously doesn't mean it'll happen with all of them, or any of them for that matter. But it certainly will within the next 2 years for at least 3 of them, which means Mike will have to do some eventual retooling. For now, even if some of them do take a step back, they'll still be instrumental in any Grape's success, especially when you have Jokic to help put them over the top. For as impressed as I was with Napa Valley's lot of keepers, I'm equally unenthused by their draft. Again, this is Mike's first draft with the DBL. Most of us have been drafting for 5 years in this league and still haven't figured it out ourselves, so it's more than understandable if Mike didn't wind up with an absolutely killer board. For a first-time draft, it's not horrible either. Josh Hart was his first pick in the 3rd round, and this is most likely the best player he wound up with. Hart is also surrounded by many guards and hybrid forwards on the Knicks, but he averaged 20 fantasy points last year and has shown to be able to contribute in multiple categories. He can score when he needs to, rounds up some steals, grabs an awesome amount of rebounds for a guard, and can even dish the rock to rack up assists. These things don't often all happen in the same game to equate to triple-doubles or intensely great fantasy numbers, but he should be a fine option that hovers around the 19 to 20 fantasy point range all year. With the 33rd pick, the Grapes signed Phillies' Paul Reed, and I know a lot of Sixers fans I talk to seem to be pretty high on his upside, but for fantasy, I don't think it's going to pan out, at least not this year. There's no real verification that he's going to start, which puts his value up in the air, because if he doesn't, I don't see him being too useful since Nick Nurse has been known to ride his starters all game. If he does get at least 25 minutes a night though, though, there's a chance that could turn into about 19 fantasy points per game. Jordan Clarkson came next, and I just might be a bit lower on him than most. He's a good NBA player and one of the better options on the Jazz when you're talking about scoring the basketball, but he averaged 18 fantasy points last year in a system that actually saw him average the most fantasy points he's ever put up in his life. That's not really persuasive enough for me to think he's going to be a consistent player. Maybe he can mimic last year's efforts, but that's also not saying much, as 18 fantasy points is practically a free agent pickup in our league. In his final two slots, Mike chose Trey Jones and Klay Thompson. I don't really mind the Trey Jones pick. I thought he was a breakout candidate last season on a shitty-ass San Antonio team, but he was pretty mid all year long, which was disheartening with such a little amount of talent around. But he actually wound up picking it up towards the end of the year and managed to finish the season with a strong 19 fantasy points per game. He's still got the starting spot, so really all he has to do now is throw it over to Wemby, and his fantasy numbers have a better chance of going up. I can see him averaging 21 fantasy points, which would make him a sneaky good pick for the Grapes in the 5th round. And while it's also on record that I'm really not a Klay Thompson connoisseur when it comes to fantasy, I don't hate this selection as the last pick in the draft. He's constantly been a keeper or high draft pick in the past before, which always rubbed me the wrong way because he's not necessarily an electric fantasy player. He's consistently averaged like 18 to 21 fantasy points his entire career, even in his prime. It's probably going to be on the lower end of that spectrum this season after putting up 19 last year, but for the final pick in the draft, I'm not too upset with it. He can contribute here and there, so, I'm sure Mike will be able to find better pieces on the wire or through trades, but he could have done much worse too. This wasn't a very compelling draft at the end of the day. I like Hart and Jones, but not in terms of being awe-inspiring fantasy players or keeper-worthy prospects down the line. They'll offer some doable fantasy points, but unfortunately this draft won't move the needle for Mike and the Grapes. That's kind of the reason I have them finishing in 6th and not higher. With better acquired players, they could have easily been 5th or 4th, but I just think a few of the teams ahead have an overall slightly stronger unit. Of course, anything's possible with Mike since he has a blistering hot Jokic and handful of pronounced performers, but he's also figuring out the DBL for the first time ever, which will probably set him back a little bit. This middle tier of teams is super tough to correctly project, so I can see him finish as high as 4th or maybe even miss the playoffs entirely, but I'm pretty comfortable with this ranking for now. We'll see how Mike adjusts to the league throughout his first season and if he was the right man for the job to overtake Ish. Starting off the top 5, I have last year's all-fantasy selection, the Peach Creek Oofmagoos. Gio had a splendid season and his best managed campaign to date, going 13-6 and showing how dominant his roster can be when healthy. Except that's the main problem, when healthy. The Magoos struggled with injuries all season long but still survived with a bevy of skilled supporters until the first round of the playoffs where they flamed out due to their best players being sidelined. Much like the Whales, on paper this is a deadly-looking club, but factoring in other components might have Peach Creek fighting for a second consecutive postseason appearance for the entirety of the schedule. With little to no draft capital over the next few seasons, it's going to be tough for Gio and the Magoos to put together another elite roster from top to bottom, and the W's on the calendar are likely to decrease with the influx of injured stars. Nothing has to be said about Tatum. He averaged over 30 points per game for the first time in his career to go alongside practically 9 rebounds too. The Magoos will continue to deploy the superstar, and LaMelo can also reach incredible heights with his all-around play, but will hopefully remain healthier than in his previous stint. He only played in 36 games but presented the league with continued ascension. I'm just a tad concerned he'll have a myriad of injuries because it felt like every time he returned last year, he immediately went back to the hospital. But if you thought his injuries were bad, welcome in KD and AD, two of the best to ever play the game but are guaranteed to miss giant chunks of the schedule every season. It's not even really speculation at this point, it's a guarantee. They're unbelievable fantasy assets, but they're also scary to own because their missed time will cause headaches and probably pile on losses. When they play, they'll get the Magoos dubs in blowout wins, but they're going to be liabilities throughout the season. Speaking of liability, enter Kyrie Irving, who we can probably bet on to stir up some sort of controversy and miss time. If he's not sitting out games from an injury, it'll probably be due to a random rant or scenario that he hones in on. He managed to be stellar on the Mavs last year, even next to Luka, so I don't think that's really gonna change, but I'm always worried about how much he's gonna play. If you can stomach the problems, he's a great keeper. Changing gears to Ayton, he's never really astounded as an NBA player, but now with the move to Portland, he's got a chance to break out. Don't get me wrong, his fantasy game has always been consistently above 27 fantasy points, which is marvelous, but at the same time, he's always felt a bit underwhelming. There's obviously an opportunity for him to raise his stats to another level, but I honestly don't think it's going to be that much of a big difference maker. I'm projecting around 29 to 30 fantasy points for Ayton, which is a 2 to 3 point increase, but I don't see it going too much higher personally. I need to see it first before I fully buy in, but obviously 30 damn fantasy points is still an absolutely awesome keeper for Gio and the Magoos. Even if I've been cautious of the risk involved with a bulk of the guys I just listed, they're all able to dominate at any given moment, so I get why someone could be high on all of these players. However, the next two aren't really going to turn many heads. Van Fleet is a fresh keeper for the Magoos after trading for him last year at the deadline in an all-in move, but I can't help but feel he's trending downwards. His play seemed to fall off a tiny bit last year, plus he's going to be 30 before the end of this season. While he can still be depended on for like 3 or 4 more years, his fit on the Rockets is certainly questionable. They just drafted Amen Thompson to be their floor general of the future, and if you also take into account their abundance of hungry young prospects such as Jalen Green, Alperen Sengun, Jabari Smith, and more, his production has the possibility of fiercely falling off. I still think he'll average somewhere between 21 to 22 fantasy points, and Kevin Porter Jr. ruining his career helps Fred's stock as well, but we're still looking at a probable drop from the past 2 years. I could be wrong, maybe he'll, be the best fantasy player on the team, but either way, he should be a sufficient piece for the Magoos. Lastly, however, comes RJ Barrett, who I just can't believe Gio kept again for the third straight season when it could be argued that he shouldn't have even been kept once. He averaged 16 fantasy points last year, and while you never know with NBA players and eventually he might finally break out at some point, 16 fantasy points is not only horrible for someone you're keeping, but was even a step down from the previous few seasons. A breakout for RJ at this point would be like 21 fantasy points a game, which is not that luxurious either, so this is one decision that Peach Creek completely whiffed on. Overall, as I stated several times, the keepers here are pretty awe-inspiring when you don't factor in the injuries and issues that come with them, but unfortunately most of them have enormous red flags in one way or another, and when you finalize RJ Barrett to a keeper spot with the rest of these flaws, you're basically just adding insult to injury, quite literally. If these guys are all able to stay on the court, then the RJ keeping won't be the abysmal disaster that I fear, but we're talking about a massive if here. Shifting over to his draft, Gio has never really put together a worthwhile assortment of selections outside of the DBL's debut season, but this is most likely his best draft since. I don't think it's great, and yet again has the chance to be a dud of a draft, but there's also quite a bit of hope. With the 16th pick, Gio rocked with former Magoo's cornerstone Ben Simmons. This is a risk, but a pretty good one. It seemed like a lot of people were high on Simmons during the draft, but I'm gonna be honest, at the time I was just like, I don't really see it. Now, look, the risk reward is through the roof. If Ben could even just get back to like 10, 7, and 6, we're looking at like 22 fantasy points a game, but I don't really have a lot of faith that he's going to revert to his prime of like 15, 8, and 8. He hasn't proved that he's confident enough to take over a team again. He still obviously can't shoot, and I would imagine his nagging injury history is going to come into play as well. I think it's more likely that we see a repeat of last season, 6, 6, and 6 to go along with about 18 fantasy points. If he can stay healthy and actually get into rhythm, then yeah, I like this choice. There's no pressure with KD and Kyrie gone, and hopefully that means he can relax and play to his strengths. But it's still a pretty big risk for the Magoos to take when they definitely need proven or clear breakout candidates to help them win while their roster goes all in. A common theme with the Magoo's drafting history is holding on to the belief that someone they previously rostered will finally break out or find their groove again. Enter Christian Wood, who at one point was a stud in the fantasy realm, but after being relegated to a bench role due to poor attitude and effort, only mustered up 22 fantasy points a night. That's still agreeable, especially in limited minutes, so we know C. Wood has the offensive toolkit to put up big fantasy numbers. However, he's playing on the Lakers behind Anthony Davis, and I don't know where exactly he falls as an option for the team. We all know AD is going to get hurt at some point, paving the way for Wood to accumulate more playing time, but based on their other rotational pieces like Vanderbilt and Hachimura, along with LeBron obviously, I don't think he's going to get many minutes or put up stats viable to the DBL. We know that he can, but I just don't think he's an integral part of the Lakers. He totally could be since we know how skillful he is as a player, but we'll have to see what the GM thinks of him as the season plays out. Next come two players that I seem to be less thrilled with than the masses, Anthony Simons and Keldon Johnson. These aren't laughable picks or anything, I think they're pretty safe, at least in the context of adding score-first athletes that don't provide much else. Simons again has a bunch of guards to battle for minutes with, and even if he is locked in as the full-time 35 minutes per game starter, he's going to struggle putting up capable fantasy points. I think the best case scenario for Simons this year is like 24 points a game, 3 rebounds, and 4 assists on like 21 fantasy points, which is a pretty sweet pickup late into the third round, but that's the best case scenario in my opinion, with other guys like Scoot and Sharp demanding the ball, as well as touches to be distributed between Grant and Ayton. Don't forget Brogdon either. Simons may stay put at like 17 to 18 fantasy points, which isn't enough to help the Magoos' chances at getting a ring. And with Keldon Johnson, I was sold on him last year when the Gems kept him since he was finally going to be the central structure of the Spurs offense, but he was incredibly inefficient and unreliable as the main guy, which was wildly underwhelming since the Spurs were a terrible team that presented him with ample room to put up empty stats. He only averaged 19 fantasy points with no one else beside him. Bring in Wemby and another year of growth from Devin Vassell, who I think easily overtakes Keldon this season. Johnson is going to be at best repeating with 19 fantasy points, but even more likely dropping close to 17. He's still very young and could prove me wrong, especially as someone being drafted in the 4th round, but I just don't think he's really got it in him if he couldn't even manage to put together an impressive campaign with nobody surrounding him all year. Finally, in the follow-up draft, Gio submitted his pick with a wildcard choice in Sasha Vezenkov. He's 28, so although he's a rookie, he's an established professional who won the EuroLeague MVP. That's kind of the problem here, though. I don't think there's much, if any, room for him to grow as a player. Not only is he kind of buried behind Sabonis, Murray, and Barnes, but it's not like he's going to come out and really be too much of the star that he was overseas. He averaged 17 points in Euroball, and usually these international players that come over later in their career just means they were never really good enough to do it when they were younger. Maybe he's good, but I don't see a world where he averages more than 14 fantasy points. So I'm not really all that amazed with this draft. I think Ben Simmons was Gio's best selection, but there's still a ton of mystery surrounding him. As for everyone else, they also have a chance to become stable fantasy options, but there isn't one person here that you can validate as a surefire thing. That's not really great news for the Magoos, considering it's going to be another season potentially wasting what's left of guys like Kevin Durant, Anthony Davis, and Kyrie Irving. You never know if they're just going to miss an entire season, or in Kyrie's case, just mentally check out, so you need to strike while the iron is hot, especially since Peach Creek is grasping at straws when it comes to draft compensation over the next 3 years. The workings of a dynamite fantasy squad are here, but between all their injuries, question marks, and RJ Barrett, I can't place them within the top 4. If my prediction turns true and the Magoos wind up as a 5 or 6 seed, I'd heavily advise them to blow it up entering the offseason. It'll be hard to make it work between injured stars and not having the draft capital to trade for more support, which Gio is going to have to do to fill this team out accordingly. While there's always hope that a team of this caliber could hypothetically earn themselves a finals appearance even, I think they're going to be a middle-of-the-road roster that puts up a fight with every matchup, but ultimately doesn't win enough to get it done. It's quite odd talking about the latest season and not having to predict the same song and dance of Sam and Ish, who both retired this past offseason in addition to CJ's departure. Their legacy and impact will live on, for better or for worse. Sam had one of the most frustrating tenures in the DBL, at times looking like the best team in the league as a one-time All-Fantasy alum and being a 2-time triple-doubles leader, only to follow it up with the complete opposite most of the time, being selected to 3 All-Dumbass teams and 1 Dumbass of the Year. He experienced great highs, such as finishing in 3rd in 2022, and having one of the most stacked rosters in the early years of the league, but faced some of the lowest lows imaginable too. Luckily for the former ball club of Big Smoke, Sam's longtime friend, college roommate, and overall great person in Gian Gonzalez has stepped in to take control of the organization and rebranded the team to the Magic City Mad Hatters. Can this finally be the year this talented roster finds some success with new ownership at the helm, or will they crumble under the weight and disappoint once again? First of all, I gotta thank and applaud Gian for accepting his invite to the DBL and showcasing the passion and determination it takes to be in this brotherhood. Right out of the gate, Gian proved he was eager to join, claiming he had what it took to be a part of our dedicated league. Within days of accepting, Gian relocated the team, made a Twitter for his club, and took a careful look at the league rules, regulations, history, and picks associated with his roster. Of course, he made a huge splash as well when he traded a slew of picks for Jimmy Butler and Kyle Kuzma, further illustrating why he'll be a caring manager, as he's already made half the amount of trades Sam had in his entire career. But that doesn't mean there's not going to be issues with this roster, or that they could hypothetically be classified as a borderline playoff team. As is the case with most of the keepers in this video, the Mad Hatters are undeniably loaded with strong fantasy performers, but their concerns lie in their ability to stay healthy. SGA is a fucking superstar and is only 25 still. He made the All-NBA first team last season, and I fully believe he'll replicate that, or what's scary is that he could even build upon it. The only drawback comes from what I mentioned about this team, and it starts with him. He played last year, but the previous 2 to 3 seasons saw him sit out with injury at the end of the schedule. Was that OKC being cautious and shutting him down to tank, or is he injury prone? Right now, we have to assume it was the tank, but SGA has to show he can play another full season again, and if he does, Gian will be reaping the rewards. But Curry and LeBron are plagued with the same problems. I correctly predicted they'd miss a chunk of time last season, and while they were still phenomenal when they played, they're definitely missing stretches of the year. Look, they're going to be 36 and 39 this year, and they're just not as durable as they were in their primes. Bron's been an injury concern ever since he signed with the Lakers. There's also still the chance they happen to regress in some regards because of how old gold they're getting, but I'd assume they're still both going to be above 30 fantasy points per game, which is obviously unreal. It's just how much time are they going to miss, and will Gian be able to float above water with their absences? This is why it's worrisome, because unfortunately Jimmy Buckets falls into a similar category. He'll probably miss a stretch or two throughout the season, but he's going to be at that same level of 29 to 31 fantasy points as long as he's on the court. Did Magic City overpay for another elite fantasy contributor that might miss a handful of weeks at an old age also? You can surely think it might have been too much at 2 firsts and a second, but when he plays, he's going to assist the Mad Hatters quite a bit, especially if their other stars are already on the sidelines. Plus, he's got that SGSF eligibility, which I always find valuable. DeJounte Murray's an interesting one because he was so good on the Spurs, but as the secondary ball handler in Atlanta, he fell back to earth at only 24 fantasy points. He's still young enough to maybe bring that back up a few points, but I feel like as long as he's not the main focus, his numbers are going to be relegated to 24 or 25 fantasy points, which is definitely useful, but not the asset he once was. And when we talk about Brandon Ingram, I've never been as sold on him as the rest of the world. He's an all-star caliber player, but he's also injury prone, which probably goes over everyone's head since he shares a team with Zion. Not only that, but he hasn't made much improvement since coming over to New Orleans. Last year was pretty underwhelming until the last third of the season, where he was so good he was able to lift his averages up to 24 points, 5 rebounds, 6 assists, and 26 fantasy points, but he also does this every year. He goes off in the final frame of the schedule and starts the first half of the year off slowly and not at the heights that we always expect him to reach. He's also still young enough that he can surely become that player all season long for the next 3 to 5 years, but I've been waiting on that for like 4 seasons now, so I wouldn't be surprised if he's unhealthy and disappointing once again. Westbrook is quite an interesting one to analyze as well. We all remember how commanding Russ was just a few years back, but the shift to the teams in Los Angeles has depicted what the twilight years of his career will look like. He seemed to fit in with the Clippers and still furnish a decent chunk of fantasy points, but it's hard to interpret how reliable he may truly be in his 16th season. In a limited possible bench role as the third or fourth option offensively, Russ can still rack up counting stats, but the triple-doubles will come in less supply. Averaging 22 fantasy points last year is of course more than manageable, so if he can replicate that, he would be a good final keeper. But I don't see him raising much higher or transforming back into the lethal Westbrook we know. At best, he may add a few points back at 24, which would be stellar for his age and situation now. However, there's a real, very real possibility he drops to 20 or 21 as he becomes older and less crucial to a team's rotation. I'm very curious to see how he performs this upcoming year, but if I had to guess, he'll be around the 21 to 22 fantasy point mark. Lastly, Kuzma is the other guy that came along in the Butler trade. Wait. Gian traded for Kyle Kuzma and didn't keep him. So the Butler trade that I pitched to him with Kuzma for a third becomes Jimmy Butler for 2 firsts, a second, and a third, furthering the claims that I took advantage of Gian to get more than what the market was offering. Well, Magic City elected to roll with Spencer Dinwiddie in his place, and I actually don't hate this. I definitely think it's a mistake to choose him over Kuz, especially when the Mad Hatters used to pick on him, but from the context of Dinwiddie himself, as long as he's the starting point guard and healthy all year, he could easily average 21 to 22 fantasy points. I think for the most part, Spencer's been kind of unspectacular over the past 4 seasons or so in terms of the DBL, so nobody's really had much need for his services, but he could definitely be a helpful insertion for somebody's lineup and arguably even a worthy keeper. But the problem is that yes, Gian traded for Kuzma, but he should without question also have a much stronger campaign than Dinwiddie. I mean, I know he drafted him, but we'll get to that. It's funny because Kuzma and Dinwiddie had that beef with each other too, but Kuzma is the 1A or B of a terrible Washington team that will get a lot more shot attempts, rebounds, and opportunities than Spencer, even with Din practically being the second option himself. Kuzma averaged 22 fantasy points last year next to guys like Beal and Porzingis, and I don't know if Dinwiddie's ever averaged 22 fantasy points in his whole career. So I admire the gamble and do think Spence could be a solid part of the Mad Hatters, and again, Gian is new to the league, so I'm not really criticizing his decisions at this juncture, but I'm not in love with the idea of him being a keeper. All signs, I'm sorry, I've been talking a lot, just bear with me as I say swines instead of signs. All signs point to Kuz being the superior fantasy option, and it's fine if he had a change of heart, but it's a shame when you waste a draft pick in the process. And not to mention, Ben Simmons could, in some ways, hypothetically, be the better option and relegate Spencer Dinwiddie back to that 18 or 19 fantasy point range, which kind of makes this whole thing even worse. So those are some things to think about in this whole context of the Dinwiddie-Kuzma cycle we got going on here. Overall, these keepers are still in the upper echelon of the DBL to me. I'm a bit unsure of Dinwiddie and Westbrook, and these injury-prone players that fill up the rest of Gion's core are alarming to an extent, but there's still an absurd amount of gifted players on the Mad Hatters. Moving on to the draft, yeah, Gian decided to use that third overall pick on Kuzma anyway. It's just odd, because if Gian felt that he really wanted both Kuzma and Dinwiddie, he probably would have been better off keeping Kuzma and drafting Dinwiddie with like the 18th pick, because I doubt he would have been taken before that. I mean, I don't know what the rest of the league thinks of him, but I can promise promise you that he wouldn't have been a first-round pick. He could have gotten like Jalen Williams or Mark Williams and still had Kuzma and Dinwiddie in the process. So it's a bit of a confusing tactic, but specifically focusing on the selection of Kuzma, it's a great pick. He should have been a keeper, which automatically makes him one of the best players available. Is he going to put up 30, 10, and 6? Of course not, but with Beal and Porzingis gone, Kuz is either the 1A or 1B next to Jordan Poole. I think it's safe to assume he's looking at close to 23 points per game, 8 plus rebounds, and 3 to 4 assists. He could be anywhere from 23 to 25 fantasy points this year, making him either an elite role player or a borderline DBL all-star. There's a chance inefficient shooting holds him back from actually improving, but even that's still a solid 22 fantasy points a game, which makes him a must-stash for any team. With that 18th pick, Magic City landed on Mitchell Robinson. He's a peculiar player because the skill set is there to be a dominant fantasy force, but he always winds up underwhelming by not ever getting there. He's consistently on the cusp of breaking out, but at 21 fantasy points last year, it didn't happen, and it's hard to say if he'll finally make that leap now. Based on his history, I'd say that it's not likely, but it's always going to be feasible that he at least reaches the 24 fantasy point plateau. That'd be a snag for Gian, but if he's once again injured or simply on the same wavelength that we've been accustomed to, he'll probably be an annoying player to own. Still, if he can put up 21 fantasy points a night, that's a good addition for the Mad Hatters to take on. At 23, Gian selected Kevon Looney, and this is a decent choice too. He started off slow last year, but finished the season averaging nearly 20 fantasy points and seems to get even better in the playoffs with some impressive rebounding numbers. If that carries into the new year and Looney gets closer to 30 minutes a night, we could be talking about 23 to 24 fantasy points. I don't have much faith in that notion considering he's been with the Warriors for practically a decade and has never really carved out a significant role, but he's still only 27, so this could be a fruitful campaign for the big. Rui Hachimura, on the other hand, is someone I'm not really vibing with. I thought he was going to be good when he entered the league, but it just never actually formulated. I know it seemed like he took a step in the right direction upon joining the Lakers, but he's still battling for minutes with Vanderbilt and Christian Wood. Besides, he's like, the fifth option if he is the starter? I know he's been working out with LeBron all summer, but I don't really reciprocate any of the hype he's been receiving. Should be a solid role player for the Lakers, but he's not going to be rosterable in the DBL. However, with Gion's final pick in the 5th round, he took Onyeka Okongwu, and I think this is a low-key potential draft-winning steal. A lot of that will depend on Clint Capella's exit out of Atlanta, but even if Capella is still with the Hawks all season, there's a legitimate chance Okongwu finally gets more minutes, as it seems like that's the direction he's slowly been trending towards the past few years. He averaged 19 fantasy points in 23 minutes last year, so even if it all stays the same, that's a pretty sublime guy to add to your team in the final round. I wasn't sure what to make of Gion's draft before it actually went down, since he's new and doesn't fully understand the dynamics yet, but this is honestly one of the better drafts in the whole league. Other than Hachimura, it's possible every single one of these guys delivers what the Mad Hatters need. They likely won't all be fantasy studs, but this is an encouraging draft for a first-year member. He's already got a really menacing foundation in place with his keepers, so if even just 2 of these guys pan out, I'd consider that a dub for the Mad Hatters. Just as it's the case with Alec and Mike, there's going to be mistakes and troubleshooting throughout the season as Gian puts the pieces together, but if everything goes right, this is a dark horse contender that I expect to be in the semifinals. On the flip side, injuries and a lack of experience may turn the tide on the Mad Hatters, causing them to maybe even miss the playoffs. I personally think this team doesn't have many contending years left based on the way Sam left it to rot with a surplus of old stars and injury-prone players, so the Jimmy Butler move helps Gian go all in for at least one last season to get the most out of these all-time veterans and potentially win it all. If it doesn't work out, the Mad Hatters still have a ton of draft capital left to initiate a rebuild and go in another direction. It all depends how the injury bug reacts this season and if Gian can prove himself to be an above-average manager, but this is still an incredible core to solidify your team with. I think they'll be somewhere in the 6 to 4 seed range, but honestly, they could be even better. It's so hard to predict where everyone's going to land, but I'm more confident placing Magic City here than anywhere else. Finishing with the bronze medal this year, I have the only remaining team in LA, the Stars. Last season, Gary did the unthinkable, bringing his team to the finals after going 0-19 365 days earlier. The turnaround accomplished by the organization speaks volumes about the persistence and intellect Gary has as a manager, and that when the going gets tough, he won't crumble under the weight of it all. It was an astonishing all-fantasy, best draft, and most improved campaign for the Stars, who also finished as the runner-up in MVP and GM of the Year voting. Unfortunately, as we all know, LA came up short in the finals, but they were ever so close to their first chip. Although I have them only in 3rd, this is still a full-on contender that has just as good of a chance as the teams ranked higher. Like the rest of the top tier fantasy players, we know what we're getting out of Embiid. I'll always be a little pessimistic with his injury woes and maybe have some fear that a decline isn't off the table for the star big man within the next 2 seasons or so, but he's obviously as elite as they come. Moving on to the next player Gary traded for in Season 4's offseason, Jaylen Brown is also lethal when it comes to fantasy. He took his game to greater heights, and who knows, maybe he can continue to rise even higher. There's a chance he got that fat $320 million contract and resorts to the 24 or 25 fantasy point margin he previously upheld, especially with Drew and KP taking away some valuable counting stats, but he's durable, efficient, and still young enough to get better. He's one of my favorite pieces in LA. Devin Booker is also probably the best shooting guard in the NBA and a dynamite keeper to have on one's roster. He was absolutely sensational in the postseason, shooting unbelievably efficient splits while displaying a complete all-around game. Throughout the history of our league, though, he's had a mid-20s fantasy average, around 25 or 26 fantasy points. Last year was his best in the DBL, however, at 27 per game. With Durant and Phoenix from the start and Beal being a more productive player than CP at this point, Book's numbers could slide back down to 25. The other side of it is that he's entering his prime and only getting better, while the other two stars are massive injury risks each year, so we could see him bump up to 28 or 29. I'm very interested to see how it plays out, but either way, Booker should be a fantastic option for the Stars. I'll always be a big believer in Darius Garland, as the former Knight has already seen impressive growth and all-star selections in both the NBA and DBL. He managed to stay at the 24 fantasy point mark this past year despite the inclusion of Donovan Mitchell, which goes to show the amount of skill he carries. But I guess that's also the issue with Garland. Is he going to be able to take his numbers any further as long as Mitchell is in town, or is he going to stay at a rate of a likable but still sort of disappointing 24 fantasy points? This is the season we find out. As for someone that's definitely elevating their game, Mikal Bridges is looking to be an all-star as soon as this year. With no other offensive dynamite in Brooklyn, I foresee a world where Bridges averages 25, 5, and 5 on impressive efficiency too. He'll probably struggle a bit, but if the last few months of last season are any indication, he's going to be averaging 25 to 26 fantasy points. Now we have to talk about another one of those players that's just so hard to get a read on. Kawhi Leonard is obviously a sensational star that you're wowed by every game he suits up, but you don't really know how much he's going to suit up, and for both of the LA teams in the Stars and Clippers, you've got to reach your breaking point eventually. I mean, ask Gary if stashing him for a year and then suffering through the first half of last season's load management and worrisome stat lines was worth it, and he'll probably respond with a resounding yes. After a truly horrible start to the year, around January, Kawhi finally reverted back to his old self and honestly looked like he was playing some of the best ball of his entire career. But once again, in the NBA playoffs, Kawhi got hurt for the millionth time, and even if he's healthy and ready to go for the beginning of the season, this means another long stretch of the schedule that he'll be sitting out games and playing lackadaisically. I don't know if Gary's going to be lucky enough to get through that for a second straight year with even more competition in the DBL. Every game during the regular season is going to be crucial to not only make the playoffs but secure seeding. Look, clearly Kawhi is going to put up some awesome lines when he eventually plays, but this cycle is just going to repeat itself until the day he retires. The new rules regarding load management and stars resting will help his case a little bit, but he's still going to be limited even when he's fully healthy, plus I wouldn't be shocked if the Clippers just paid the fines to let him sit. Let's talk about another guy that I've been critical of, Jamal Murray. Contrary to popular belief, I'm not a Murray hater. I think he was absolutely incredible in the Nuggets championship run and has always been an unbelievable playoff performer. But we can praise the man at the same time that we speak on his negatives, and when it comes to fantasy, he's just straight up never been that good throughout his entire 7-year career. He hasn't been awful or even bad by any means, but last season was his best fantasy campaign by far at only 22 fantasy points per game. Now, of course, in these past 2 seasons, you have to factor in that he was either injured or returning from said injury, and it's a great sign that he had his best performance following his ACL tear. And while we're on that subject, I do believe that Murray is going to continue to improve. I am hesitant that he's going to be this otherworldly fantasy player the way he turns up in the playoffs, but I definitely think it's about time that he can be a legit 24 fantasy point donor. If not, well then I think it's pretty much set in stone that he's just not someone you want to embrace on your fantasy team, but I'd imagine he's going to step it up this year, and it's still very possible he does become the Kyrie Irving type of second option to Jokic's LeBron, but I'm still foreshadowing more of a Chris Middleton to Jokic's Giannis. Finally, Miles Turner was simply amazing for the Stars in their all-fantasy run. He's always been a solid contributor for the past 5 seasons, but it was usually somewhere around the 23 to 24 fantasy point spot, followed by a ton of injuries and missed games. I'm more prone to believing Turner's DBL All-Star nod was a bit of an outlier, reaching the 27 fantasy point plateau and playing in 62 games, which still isn't a trailblazing amount, but 20 more than the previous 2 seasons. And get this, he put up a whopping 18 points this year, when in the past 5 seasons games combined, he's only averaged 12 points. So I don't think it's hard to see why I would believe that Turner might not be as good as last year, but he's also got a few things going for him. For starters, he's entering his prime and at 27 still has a handful of useful years left. Secondly, I think his stats are getting a significant bump from Tyrese Halliburton's usage. Ever since Miles Turner has entered the league, the Pacers have never really had an elite point guard that could set him up for easy baskets, but now with Halliburton, he's primed to get a lot more opportunities, so I can certainly see his scoring numbers staying around the same level. My biggest concern is still with his injury woes, but Turner should hopefully still hover around 25 or 26 fantasy points. All in all, regardless of some of the hiccups I have with these guys, there's no denying the all-around level of impact here. Even with some of their issues, and many of them will display those flaws, basically every keeper here is good, and that is extraordinary when most teams start struggling with their lower-level keeps. The Stars, though, have a wide assortment of reliable candidates, they just need to stay healthy and keep up their ferocious play. And moseying on over to their draft, it was a decent way to fill out the roster and remain a top team in the league. I don't really think this was an exceptional draft or the kind of board that'll actually win the league, but it's going to help keep the Stars atop the standings. For example, with their first round pick, LA selected Tyler Hero, and he should be a decent role player for the Stars, but I'm kind of in the camp that he is what he is now. Unless he finally gets his own team in the vein of Jordan Poole or something, he's probably capped at like 21 fantasy points a night. He's still young and could be hungry after all the trade rumors, but I feel as if there were better players available so early on. Gary also had picks 11 and 12, which are the first two picks of the second round, but I personally feel as if he squandered these selections too. I'm probably less of a fan of these guys more than most, and they should still be solid enough options to pick up the slack, but they just don't really do it for me. First is Brook Lopez, and I know he was fantastic last year to the tune of 23 to 24 fantasy points, but as far as I know, that's an outlier season for the big man. When has he ever been this good? He's 35 years old and over the past 5 seasons or so has been maybe a 17 fantasy point producer. I don't think he's dropping by 6 or 7 whole fantasy points, but a 20 to 21 fantasy point season is surely on the horizon. Maybe he can be excellent 2 years in a row, but I'm not counting on it. The other veteran guy I'm not very high on is Aaron Gordon. He's a certified champion, reliable role player, and averaged 22 fantasy points per game last season, but like Brook, he's never been this good ever. It just seemed like an obvious outlier year last season from my point of view. He averaged 18 and 16 fantasy points the past 2 seasons, and remarkably 21 going back 3 years, but he was on the Magic and was like the second leading scorer. However, the counter argument is that you can say, Joe, 2-time back-to-back champion Joe, because that's how you have to address me now. He was surprisingly consistent, and as you stated yourself, 22 fantasy points is pretty damn functional, especially as a second round pick. Who's to say he can't mimic that or even take it further? And look, you're not wrong, that's the beauty of fantasy basketball. Who really knows who is going to have a breakout campaign or dramatically fall off a cliff? We just have to use what we know and theorize scenarios based on the past. But being that these are my projections, I think that even if Aaron Gordon is able to replicate last year's numbers, there were probably a few better alternatives left on the board. Like, if he can still average 22 fantasy points, I really can't hate on this choice much at all, but I just feel like there's opportunity for slippage with him where he possibly falls down to 20 a game. These are safe, fine draft selections, and this was a challenging position in the draft with other players potentially being riskier, so I don't blame Gary so much. I'm just not as individually in love with them as fantasy accessories. Heading all the way down to the 4th round, the Stars took LA's own D'Angelo Russell. Again, this is a decent stash, but I'm not a big D'Lo guy at all. He may average 19 to 20 fantasy points as like the 4th option, because that's what he is now, but honestly, he could even dip to like 17 or 18. I've also never been a huge Jeremy Grant fan, but I have to applaud Gary for being able to get him in the 5th round. He's always going to be somewhere in the ballpark of 20 fantasy points, so to squeeze him into your final roster with such a late pick is worth commending. Lastly, Gary had an extra pick who he had to drop but went with rookie Taylor Hendricks. He could have an interesting start to his career, and this pick doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things anyway, but I have serious doubts about his ability to be fantasy relevant in 2024. In the end, this isn't a game-changing draft. Jeremy Grant, Tyler Hero, Brook Lopez, Aaron Gordon, and D'Angelo Russell are passable inclusions, but none of them are going to transform into keeper-worthy accomplices overnight. That's not always the quote-unquote point of the draft, but my goal is to personally select a few people that could wind up as potential keepers the following season, all while choosing team members who can help me win in the process. It's tricky, I failed miserably at it in the past, but I feel like that's what most franchises should be aiming for. I don't think the Stars got any extra keepers, which doesn't make this a terrible draft, but these guys are all pretty much prototypical fantasy role players who may even suffer setbacks in their production. But still, the Los Angeles keepers are hard to criticize in many ways, and if Gary can be as dedicated to improving his team as he was last year by making trades and staying persistent on the wire, they could easily find themselves in back-to-back finals with an opportunity to win it all. I just think the two teams ahead are a little meatier and fully fleshed out, but you simply can't count out the reigning Western Conference champions. It will please many of you to know that I don't have the Knights finishing in first this year. Don't get it twisted, NJ is still going to be one of the best teams in the league for the beginning, middle, and end of the season, and I think their odds at a championship this year are just as high as in the past, but the difference is that a lot of other rosters have entered the same discussion now. These are the back-to-back reigning champs, winning it all over the past 2 seasons in dominant fashion, but had to survive dozens of injuries and get lucky in the process to do so. I'm certainly not taking anything away from myself. I'm sure I'd be the first to tell you that I worked my ass off to create a threatening force in the East for years to come, but there's always a little luck involved in winning to some extent. Can I actually three-peat? It's scary that I still have an unbelievably strong chance in doing so, and I'm going to do everything I can to make that a reality and be recognized as the first ever true dynasty of our league, but with all the competition this year, it's viable to assume I'm not getting the gold 3 years in a row. But then you immediately think, how could I not, when you remember Luka's the best player on my team and is still only 24 years old. Alongside Domantas Sabonis, who is only just entering his late 20s, this is one of the most lethal 1-2 punches in the entire league. 2 European dynamites that have a high probability of dropping a triple-double on any given night. Sabonis ascended into top 5 fantasy player territory this past season with co-star Luka Doncic, and although there may be a slight slip in the numbers, he's still a safe bet for 36 plus fantasy points, and always the possibility he could continue to elevate his game even further. Now let's talk about the big one. Ja Morant is a bit of a puzzling entity to fully analyze at the moment. Take away the off-court stuff and Ja makes first-team All-NBA last year and people aren't saying delusional things like Jalen Brunson is a better basketball player. Absolute insanity from people because of his gun-toting bullshit. I totally understand critiquing that, and rightfully so, but that doesn't make Ja a worse basketball player. However, when it comes to availability and fantasy outlook, yeah, it is definitely concerning. Morant is slated to miss the first 25 games of the year due to suspension, which is like a third of the season. He may come back out of shape, out of rhythm, and possibly develop a new injury since Ja is such an explosive performer that's always within reach of happening. Which means on top of a guaranteed 25-game suspension, he can miss additional games as well. It could be a disastrous year for Morant, but he's also already demonstrated how magnificent he is when he's on the court. 30 fantasy points per game, only 24 years old, has the capability of bringing his stats to another tier that could insert him into the conversation of fantasy's absolute best, and is clearly just one of the most exciting players to watch every night. I truthfully don't think he's reached his ceiling yet, and that he's only getting started, but in order for that to happen, he's gotta knock the stupid shit off. Hopefully this was a wake-up call and not just some big joke to him, but if he doesn't take accountability and continues to pop up in headlines, his career and fantasy stock are going down the drain. Currently, his fantasy stock shouldn't be lower than fellow draft class member Zion Williamson's when Ja doesn't have the negative track record that Z has obtained for missing games, and I bring that up because I received some redonkulously disrespectful offers for him over the summer, which aren't appropriate until it's obvious his career is in tremendous jeopardy. As for this season alone, it may not be Ja's best, but he could also come back with a fire under his ass and ready to prove everyone wrong. We here in New Jersey stand in Ja's corner. One of my favorite and most promising players on the Knights is Josh Giddey, a 2-time DBL champ that not only contributed to both championship runs, but was actually instrumental in year number 2, averaging an under-the-radar 25 fantasy points per game. Just like Ja, Luka, and Sabonis, Giddey is on triple-double watch every night and just turned 21 a week ago. He could be in store for juicy production over the next decade. Sure, SGA is already an MVP candidate superstar, Jalen Williams impressed by almost winning Rookie of the Year, and Chet Holmgren is primed to make an immediate impact. When you look at it pessimistically, these three may be the go-to scoring options in OKC and take away touches from Gid. But optimistically, at 20 years old, he averaged 16 points, 8 rebounds, and 6 assists. Worst case scenario, we're going to be looking at prime Ben Simmons stats minus the defense. My prediction is 17 or 18 points, 8 rebounds, 7 to 8 assists, with Chet looking to be a fantastic pick-and-roll partner, 26 to 27 fantasy points in year 3 as someone that just bought their first legal drink 7 days ago. Is it too good to be true? It's very likely. Like I said, there's the pessimistic and optimistic side, but through 2 seasons, Giddey has been an electrifying young asset, and I don't see any reason to distrust that notion yet. Speaking of triple-double caliber talent, Pascal Siakam is yet another guy capable of giving you 20, 10, and 10 in every other game. Spicy P has been with the Knights since our inaugural season and has managed to improve significantly since. There are still holes in his craft and worries to be had with him. He's approaching 30 in April, and the Raptors could be moving away from him as the focal point of the offense, with Scotty Barnes next in line and a youth movement seemingly on the horizon. He may be facing some regression, as well as entering an entirely new city if he's traded away from Toronto. That could bring his fantasy average down to 25 or 26 as opposed to the impressive 30 points per game mark he's had the past 2 years, but there's still a decent likelihood he can remain in the upper 20s. Either way, Siakam should still be a supremely effective option for New Jersey. Now it's time to start talking about one of the players on my team that I have some negatives and caution for entering the year. Jarrett Allen was still pretty damn spectacular last season, averaging 27 fantasy points, but that was a 3-point drop-off from his All-Star campaign. That's probably due to the inclusion of Donovan Mitchell, as that trio of young talent in Garland, Mobley, and Allen all had to face some kind of downtick with his arrival, but Allen probably should have been a bit better. He's still fairly young, and I'm expecting a bit of a bump in fantasy points again, but that might not happen as this could be the role he's pretty much locked into for the rest of his career, which is obviously still an extremely valuable player. It's just underwhelming when my perception of him at least was that he can be a low to mid-30s double-double threat with 2 blocks a game for the foreseeable future. It's still in the cards, but if he can't climb back up to 30 this year, that possibility may no longer be in effect. After removing Chris Paul from the roster in the offseason, the only remaining old veteran left in New Jersey is DeMar DeRozan, but that's for pretty good reason. Debo's a 3-time champ, meaning everywhere he goes he wins, so he could act as a good luck charm for us this year en route to his 4th title. But obviously, when speaking on DeMar, he's now 34 years old and his skill and talent could hypothetically drop off at any point. If that doesn't happen, there's also the chance that he's dealt to a contender or somewhere else where his production suffers by being in a more limited role or just being lower in the pecking order. But when we also face the facts, DeRozan's been magical ever since landing in Chicago. 28 fantasy points in his first season and 26.5 last year, which is a drop, but a tiny drop that always saw him perform consistently too. You weren't getting 12-point fantasy games from DeRozan, and maybe not 50 burgers either, but he could always be relied upon to get you what you need. This could be his final bow as a star-level player though, and he could drop once again to 25 or even 24 fantasy points, but for as good and efficient as he's been, even dipping a little is fine in my eyes as my 7th or 8th best keeper. My final addition to the Knights' mainstay of players this season is Desmond Bane, the only player on NJ that wasn't kept before. There's a little bit of risk involved with this keep when I had the likes of Jimmy Butler on my team who was good for 30 fantasy points per game and easily could have made us even more imposing and scarier than we already are, but he has his qualms too, so I felt comfortable trading him when I had Desmond Bane in my back pocket. Look, even if Ja wasn't going to be missing a long stretch of the schedule, Des would still be a really nice keeper. He improved to 23 fantasy points last year after averaging 21 points, 5 rebounds, and 4 assists. I'd imagine that he can raise that again to either 24 or 25 fantasy points, but when you take into consideration Ja's lengthy absence, you have to assume that it could potentially get even higher. He will likely step in as the number 1 scoring option, with most of the offense centered around him those first few months. I think it's conceivable to assume that number can get to 27 fantasy points in Ja's sabbatical, but upon his return, maybe fall back down to 25. Either way, I have a lot of faith in him to be an all-star level threat this year, and I'd compare his game to the emergence of Jaylen Brown a few seasons ago as a legit two-way star. Maybe he doesn't improve and JJJ takes over with Ja out, and when he returns, Des doesn't ever get any more of the spotlight. Plus, we can't forget Marcus Smart being added to the roster and controlling the ball as well, so there's concepts working against Bane for sure. However, worst case scenario, we're looking at 22 or 23 fantasy points again, which is still a worthy final keeper. Hard pill to swallow if he doesn't develop further and Jimmy is incredible this season. Absolutely, I can barely swallow little pills to begin with, but I'm still confident in this decision moving forward. So honestly, obviously I'm biased, but I really don't have too many flaws with my core this year. It's okay to be biased, I think, though, when this group brought me 2 consecutive championships, but there's an eensy bit of distress that 2 or 3 of these elite benefactors from previous stints are going to take a step back this year. Clearly, though, there's amazing talent left and right, and the Knights should be smooth sailing even when factoring in Ja's suspension. Draft-wise, I don't think there's many negatives here either. Again, I'm going to have some bias for my draft. We all like our own drafts at the beginning of the year, so for the most part, the sensible things to back up your own selections, although I really didn't like mine from the jump last season. But this year, I do happen to think it's one of the best drafts in the league. Beginning with Mark Williams, this has the potential to be one of the great picks in all of draft history. Although he was a rookie last year that barely got any playtime until Mason Plumlee was traded, in that brief amount of time, it was clear the kind of potential double-double threat he could be. As long as Charlotte doesn't fuck this up, he could easily average 24 to 25 plus fantasy points this season alone. But we still haven't seen it consistently enough to truly believe he will be a monster breakout candidate, and the Hornets are a disaster of an organization, so I wouldn't put it past them to trade for JaVale McGee and start him over Williams. Following suit with a bit of an unproven big man, the Knights took on Daniel Gafford with the 13th pick, and this has potential to be a huge steal as well. Look, over the past 3 to 4 seasons, Gafford hasn't managed to be too fantasy relevant unless a Wizards center went down with an injury, thrusting him into a starting role and a surplus of minutes. That's exactly what this entire season should entail for him, so unless he starts and still only musters up 24 minutes a game, he should be in line for at least 26 fantasy points. With the 22nd pick, we head over to someone that's a bit more divisive in Chris Middleton. I won't sugarcoat it, this could wind up being a waste of a draft pick. Middleton was truly appalling last season, averaging only 18 fantasy points in a year where it didn't even reach that high of a mark until the last month of the campaign. Before that, Mitty was pretty much injured the entire duration of the schedule. Whenever he finally came back, he played like ass for 5 games and then got re-injured. He was never really able to get into a rhythm, and even if he actually did, the fact that he constantly had a giant O next to his name all year didn't help in any way. But if we're being completely honest with ourselves, that was only one season. It was a bad down year, so I get why people didn't want to touch him with the 10-foot pole entering the latest timetable. But in the grand scheme of Middleton's rise to fame in the NBA, it's an outlier. He's usually consistent and efficient year-round. I expect him to return to something close to all-star form, and I know people are also worried about Lillard taking a bunch of touches away from him, but I honestly think that having Giannis and Dame on the same team will take so much of the opposing team's defensive schemes away from Middleton that he'll get more opportunity for open looks and efficient shot making. Maybe that's wishful thinking, and truthfully, maybe Middleton is done as far as being a borderline all-star. Last year could have been a sign of what's to come, and perhaps at best we're looking at like 19 fantasy points. That's surely possible, and he may continue to get hurt and sit out a lot too, so this could very well be a useless decision for me. But at the end of the day, I think it's warranted to take at least one last stab at Cape Mid. It was a 3rd-round pick that has the chance to produce 22 fantasy points, and with SGSF eligibility, I'm more than happy to take him on. 2 spots later, I took a gamble on Obi Toppin, who probably has the biggest boom or bust potential of my draft. If any pick doesn't work out, I'd take the over on Toppin. There's no official guarantee that he's actually starting, although it's been insinuated, and he might not actually expand his game even if he's actually given those 28 to 30 minutes a night. But I think he's worth the risk. Maybe I took him an eensy bit early, but I've believed in Obi since he was drafted and never got a true chance to actually prove himself. Whenever he got the workload, he seemed to put up the statistical prowess that fantasy owners want, but it can be argued they were empty numbers or garbage time stats. Be that as it may, I think you still have to be pretty talented to basically play 10 minutes a night for 3 seasons, and when you finally get to showcase what you can do in a significant role, you ball out. He should also benefit from Halliburton setting him up and throwing him lobs, so I don't think it's wild to expect a universe where the man's averaging 22 fantasy points, but it's also not crazy to think he's only going to wind up at 15 or 16 if he can't defend or do much other than dunk the ball, especially if Jarace Walker impresses in his minutes. With the last pick in the 3rd round, I was able to get Bobby Portis, who I'm kind of shocked fell this far. He's never been an elite fantasy option or anything, but before getting injured last year, he averaged 23 fantasy points. Yes, Giannis missed a chunk of games, and this was before the Bucks acquired Jay Crowder, but with even less bench depth after the Lillard trade, I expect him to be in the same vicinity of 22 to 23 fantasy points a night. He's not a sexy draft pick, but he's a smart and dependable asset for any contender to deploy. Right after, I had my 6th selection of the draft because of Ja's suspension, because I've been playing fantasy basketball for 10 plus years and I've never seen the SSPD tag in all of that time. It's always just been an out for a guy that's been suspended. But you know, in fantasy football and other sports, sure, I've seen that and I know that happens, but it never happened in fantasy basketball to my knowledge. But now it's just been randomly implemented the year that Ja's out for 25 games and I wasted a draft pick and I wasted a trade. Right after, I had my 6th selection of the draft because of Ja's suspension, and again, I'm surprised he fell to me in Devin Vassell. I really think this guy's gonna be good. He seemed like he'd break out last season, but it happened to be an injury-riddled year for him, messing up his growth and progress. But I think he's already better than Keldon, and I'm guessing the Spurs do too. They've been one of the most consistent and professionally handled organizations for decades. They don't dole out fat contracts left and right just cuz, like most franchises, but Vassell got a bag of 140 M's this past offseason before he's really proved anything. That tells me they know he's going to be special. And look, maybe he's not, or if he is, maybe he's not going to blossom the way I'm hoping this season. But I don't think 22 to 23 fantasy points is out of the question for someone that's likely to be the 1A or 1B of the offense. He averaged 18 fantasy points last year in a bit of a disappointing campaign, so maybe that's just who he is, but I think it's completely probable he bumps that up 3 or 4 whole points. Others might feel differently about my draft, considering 3 or 4 straight selections I had resulted in crickets and absolute silence when I spoke their names, leading me to believe people aren't too keen with who I took. And they could be right, it'll get you in your head when people aren't muttering fuck under their breath or aren't exclaiming that they were going to take him next, but we'll have to see how it all plays out. If we all uploaded our projections, we'd all be higher on our own drafts than what we think of each other's, so maybe I'm not seeing things clearly, but I think this is a pretty excellent draft that supports what a lot of people would probably call the most deadly nucleus in the DBL. I mean, let's take a minute to relish in what Joe and the Knights have done over the past 2 years. 2-time champion, 2-time MVP, 2-time All-Fantasy, 2 Eastern Conference titles, 2-time GM of the Year, Trader of the Year, and an insane 33-5 record over that stretch. We really might be able to three-peat and make the rest of the league groan in dissatisfaction, so I'm excited for that, but again, the competition is stacked, making it even harder to go all the way. Plus, the Knights could get off to a rocky start. With Ja's absence, all that needs to happen are a few more injuries, my draft not panning out, keepers getting off to a slow start or declining. There's a world where we begin this year with a 2-5 record and have to fight our way back to the playoffs. Even if that's the case, we're a playoff lock, and I would not want to play a 5th seed NJ team in the first round. It seems as if the 3 to 4 year rebuild the Tropics constructed will have Cam enjoying the fruits of his labor this season, as I have Flint, Michigan finishing in first with a 15-4 record. It's interesting following Cam's franchise as he's battled both disappointment and pressure from finishing worse than expected and better than expected during his residence in the DBL. Predicting the Tropics to win the title and be this good will definitely add to the pressure to cement his team as a surefire contender, but I truly believe this is the year that Cam and the Trops will insert themselves into the best franchises in the league conversation. Last year, Cam was also expected to be a top 3 to 4 team, but flamed out early on due to unfortunate injuries. While Flint still could have persevered and finished as a top 5 team or so, Cam took the challenging but noble route of deciding to tank for the rest of the year to position himself for an even greater chance of being a powerhouse in the future. This seems to have unquestionably paid off, as the Tropics landed Giannis Antetokounmpo over the summer for a massive haul of picks. What's even crazier than that trade is that after spending 6 first-rounders, 4 seconds, and losing Jalen Duren, Flint still has 7 first-round picks, 7 seconds, an abundance of draft compensation, and a core at an average age of about 21 years old. Adding Giannis into that equation should make for a formula that produces a long period of success. Let's not forget that none of this would even be possible if Cam didn't have the balls to pull the trigger on the deal that got rid of his best player in Tyrese Halliburton a season ago. Giannis is probably about to have a revenge season after fumbling in the first round last year, and he was already averaging 40 fantasy points, so the production he's going to be bringing to Michigan should be otherworldly. Any one of these other guys I'm going to talk about next has the ability to average 27 fantasy points this year, but in my opinion, Sengun will surpass the 30-point mark. He's already showcased his mold as a performer in the vein of Jokic and Sabonis, which means there's a good chance he improves to 18 points, 10 rebounds, and 5+ assists on the campaign. That's practically Sabonis numbers already, and he's only 21. I guess there's risk for him to not develop with the new additions in Houston and a slew of other young prospects wanting to emerge as the most valuable piece on the team, but Sengun seems to have already cracked that code. Team USA himself, Anthony Edwards, is another mouth-watering asset on the Trops, an already established player with an all-star selection under his belt, but he's likely to take another big jump as the main man on the Wolves and as one of Cam's best cooperators on the roster. I wish people would pump their brakes on already proclaiming him as on that level currently, because I've seen crazy statements swearing that he's the best shooting guard in the league and better than players such as Ja Morant, SGA, Donovan Mitchell, Devin Booker, and more, and that just makes no damn sense to me. Listen to me very clearly. He has the potential to surpass those guys or anyone to be an absolutely exceptional player, and he's already very good, but he still has another tier or two to reach before he can be in the same conversation as them. Luckily, I think that this year may be the year he breaks out even further. I expect him to average 27 to 28 fantasy points and display an all-around game that can't really be argued against. Next up is Evan Mobley, another unbelievably young guy with fast potential, who averaged 26 fantasy points last year, which is crazy because it was his second year, but also because it never really felt like he took another step. He improved by a point or two, and and maybe added another rebound, but generally felt kind of stagnant. He also had a depressing playoff performance against the Knicks, so although generally he's been very good and people are still considering him a future star, we kind of need to see that this year. I don't blame him, he was only a sophomore, had to get situated with Donovan Mitchell, and still finished as the runner-up for Defensive Player of the Year, as well as averaged a strong 26 like I mentioned, but I want to see him get to that next step. If he can just get to 27 or 28 fantasy points, that'd be another low-key improvement that would insert him into the discussion for some of the best DBL players in the world. I also expect Walker Kessler, another Team USA representative, to be a legit fantasy star this year. I don't want to put too much expectations on Cam for him to perform, but I really don't think it's out of the question for him to average 28 fantasy points in a bigger workload than last season. Paolo Banchero, who beat Kessler out for the 2023 Rookie of the Year, is also primed to take another leap. He put up first-year stats that rival the likes of KD, Melo, and LeBron. I'm not saying he's going to be as good as any of those players, but his statistics are in the same universe as theirs. I'm going to guess around 25 fantasy points for the other USA rep, as I feel anything under 24 might be kind of disappointing. This is a shit Magic team, and he is the guy there, so I want to see at least 24 fantasy points out of the sophomore. Chet Holmgren, on the other hand, is technically a rookie, and a lot of people are picking him to be their Rookie of the Year over Wemby. We'll have to see if his body and frame will be able to hold up in the NBA without constant injuries, but after holding onto him for an entire year, the Tropics will finally be able to deploy a guy that could come out of the gate averaging 16 points, 9 rebounds, 2 blocks, and 24 to 25 fantasy points. Last but certainly not least takes us to Cade Cunningham, the 2021 first overall pick. There's a ton to admire about Cade, but I want to start with some apprehensive thoughts first, considering I hardly have any flaws with the rest of Cam's keepers. Although he has the toolkit to be a beast, we've really barely seen him play much, and if Cade finds himself out for long stretches during the season at all, I think we can officially label him as an injury-prone player. He missed like 90% of his sophomore year, and his first foray into the NBA had a few bumps in the road there too. These could obviously just be like freak accidents, and Cade will be on his way to being not only a healthy but productive member of the league, but I think it's worth mentioning because we still need to actually see him break out and prove to us that he's a first overall pick and star on the horizon. We've seen flashes of it, and last year's small sample size depicted a determined Cade that saw him put up some quality stat lines before going down. I fully believe if he didn't get injured, he would have put together a memorable campaign that would have seen him average upward of 24 fantasy points, but he factually only averaged 21.7. I definitely believe in his talent to be one of the Tropics' cornerstones and leaders, but this year has a lot riding on him to simply meet expectations. So while there's still always the chance that a number of these guys underperform or don't progress to the potential that they have at such a young age, partially the problem for the Tropics' failures last year, they don't exactly need to reach their pinnacle with the arrival of the Greek Freak, who's going to do more than supplement any of the young bucks off nights. However, I'd bet at least 5 of these guys improve tremendously, or at least reach this season's qualifications, which should be more than enough ammo to make Flint, Michigan the most dangerous foe in all of the league. It's also safe to say Cam's the most accurate drafter in the league, collecting 2 best draft awards and finishing as the runner-up last year. He's always going to be in the mix for a great board, and this season is no exception. After Wemby and Scoot, the Tropics most likely got the best prospect left of the list, Jalen Williams. He was remarkable as a rookie, flourishing in the second half of the year to finish with 19 fantasy points a game. He's poised to be good, and even if he doesn't flourish to elite heights in his second season, I fully expect a 3-point bump to get him to 22 fantasy points. That's not the sort of amazing average you want from a top 5 pick, but we should all know that this is a dynasty league, and it's equally, if not more so, about the long game, where Jalen Williams can possibly break into the 28 fantasy point club in just a few seasons. With the last pick in the first round, Wendell Carter Jr. comes back home to Flint, Michigan. He's a sufficient supporting piece on any fantasy team, but the days seem to be gone where he's going to be a star. Yeah, he's still young, but especially in Orlando with their developing core and options, I don't think I could bet on him being 25 plus fantasy points anymore. With his injury concerns, inconsistent play, and rise of Wagner and Banchero, there's reason to suspect a 21 or 22 fantasy point season on the table, which probably isn't the kind of palette Cam drafted him for. But he was one of the more established fantasy producers left on the board, so I can't fault this pick. And you never know, maybe he'll continue to get better, but I'm not quite as high on him as I had been the past few years. The final pick in the lottery saw Tyus Jones get selected, and yeah, this is also a pretty formidable pick. For the past 2 or 3 seasons, he's been referred to as the best backup point guard in the league, and when he's taken over starting duties in the absence of Ja, he's flashed some big numbers. While I certainly like this selection more than I don't like it, will it translate over to a Washington team for a full 82 games? And even though he will finally be starting, this Wizards roster is composed of differing personalities from Memphis. With Poole and Kuzma able to do whatever they want, I see the ball being taken out of Jones' hands more than he'd like. I still expect around 14 points and 7 assists or so on the year, but I don't know if he delegates the offense the way most floor generals will for their teams. That could be a hot take, but either way he should still be in line for a solid year. Another guy that found a way to drop all the way into the 4th round was Yusuf Nurkic. And look, I get it. I can't tell you how many games he must have missed over the past 4 years. He's one of the most injury-prone players in the game, which hurts his fantasy stock extensively. However, he still puts up about 24 fantasy points when he does actually see the floor, and now with the Suns he might play harder and with more of a purpose than he had recently on a Blazers team with no hope of winning it all. Sure, he's the 4th option now and won't really be given the ball to go to work when KD, Book, and Beal are all shooting, but he could still average 12 and 8 with some blocks and assists for 23 to 24 fantasy points a night. But Cam should also expect to be inserting him into his IR quite frequently, which is probably worth the price of admission for a 4th rounder. Closing their draft, the Tropics procured Terry Rozier at 44, and this isn't bad. It's my least favorite pick because he's a bit of a shot chucker that always plays poorly for the first half of the year. He also always seems to gain traction by January and shoot lights out, but he also only averaged 19 fantasy points last season, which was a step down from previous years. With Brandon Miller emerging as a focal point of the rotation, I'm even lower on Rozier. For the 5th round, it's an understandable choice to make, but I feel like Cam's going to regret this with Rozier on the wire by the end of the 2nd matchup. But when it comes down to brass tacks, this is one of the better drafts the DBL's seen in Season 5. We're all going to be fighting for pickups on the waiver wire, but Cam will have the least to fix with notable choices entering the year. Maybe it's a bit foolish to assume the Tropics will be this good, perhaps they're still a full season removed from pure dominance, but after a 3-season rebuild and the acquisition of Giannis, young prospects who are already contributors and looking to expand, dozens of picks to help build upon what's already in place, and a solid draft to iron out the creases of what's left, I don't know how you can't see the Tropics finishing as a top 3 team at least. Barring any injuries, they should be competing for a title and maybe the frontrunner to take it all in the eyes of everyone else, as I have Cam obtaining his 1st ring come March. And now comes the award predictions. These are always fun because you have to base it off of everything that you know now, and obviously a lot can change. But let's start with the clearest one, being that I just basically said it. Cam will be your 2024 champion, battling against the Knights in a finals rematch that will come down to the wire, but the Tropics will pull it off and begin their dynasty with a bang. I'd say Gary certainly has a chance to make a 2nd straight trip to the finals, and anyone really, but this is my 2024 DBL finals prediction. Again, the conference titles are pretty self-explanatory. I got the Tropics winning it all and having the best record in the league, so they'll garner their first ever conference title as well. Of course, the Knights stand a chance in obtaining their 4th, and the Magoos may come close as well, but I think it's Cam's year, and that starts with being the penultimate team in your conference. As for the West, although there's a lot of talented teams now, I'm still going with the Stars to receive Western Conference title number 2. You can make an argument for Gian or Mike, but I think their DBL inexperience will hurt their chances at getting a bye and controlling the West. Along those lines, MVP pretty much has to be somebody that I ranked as a top team. Once again, Cam is my predicted winner. He's going to have the best team, best record, and he'd be a brand new winner of the award, which the voters always like. Gary will be close in 2nd, I think, and as for me, I may be a really good team still, but unless the Knights are an unstoppable force that proves they're much better than the Tropics and Stars, I don't think I'm going to get many votes due to being a repeat winner already. In our 2nd year doing this award, sexiest keepers will probably follow wherever Jalen Green is kept until the end of time, so Alec is definitely the frontrunner, but I'm actually going to predict myself as the winner here. Giddey seems to be getting sexier and sexier, and when you also factor in the swag of Luka, that may hold more power over Alec's core. Remember, you can't vote for yourself for this award either, so that gives me a chance for what might be a meaningless but fun trophy nonetheless. Most Improved, definitely an intriguing award this year, as Alec, Gian, and Mike are all technically newcomers, so they can't really be voted for. I don't think anyone's going to reward James $25 after intentionally losing last year, and the rest of the league may find themselves in similar positions and records from Season 4. I think Anthony has an outside shot if everything goes perfectly and he lands inside the top half of the leaderboards, but the most obvious jump should be the Tropics, so I have Cam winning another award. Look, he was a lottery team last year with a negative record. All he has to do is basically be a top 5 team, and he'd still be in contention as the top recipient of Most Improved, but I expect him to be a great team this year, so I think he'll wind up running away with his 2nd Most Improved medal. Based on the assumptions and talking points I made earlier, I'm going to choose myself as 2024's best draft winner. Look, all of these predictions and estimations may age like milk, and the draft is always interesting to analyze since our perceptions at the beginning of the year often do a 180, but I think I took some of the more invigorating prospects. Cam's got a chance because he always does, but between being constantly in the race for that award and winning everything else this year, I don't think he gets the votes. Other people that I think have an outside shot at winning are Josh and Gian. Josh's picks are pretty much all rookies or players that still need to prove themselves, so it could be hard to choose him if they don't make an immediate impact. But if all of them can flash some sort of tantalizing upside, Josh may be slotted in as the winner for getting an abundance of young talent. With Gian, I like most of his picks, and they all have a shot at actually being rostered all year long too, but I think it's far less likely he wins considering he could have kept Kuzma in the first place, and it's more probable 1 to 2 of them are useless in the grand calculus of it all. Of course that can happen with the Knights too, as it did last year, but coming back with a dynamite draft after a depressing one a season ago may be enough of a narrative to help me win the award. Trader of the Year is one of everyone's favorites, an honor that can go to anyone and is never a clear-cut answer. The rest of the year is going to bring on an assortment of trades, and with Ish and Sam no longer around, we will likely see an influx of them as well. Although it can go to anyone, as Cam demonstrated last year as a lottery team who won the award, I'd imagine he's gonna repeat anyway. He traded for Giannis, one of the top 3 players in the league, and it's probably going to result in a crazy amount of success. Never mind the other trades Cam made and will continue to make, I think he's going back to back. You could always throw my name in there as well as a 2-time winner, and if CJ never left, he was looking like a real shot at competing for it since he obtained an assortment of picks, but that's kind of out the window now with Alec taking over the city. I think Alec does have a low-key opportunity though to be in the running. I don't love the trades he made thus far, but as an individual who's putting in effort and will continue to get a taste of how the market and league operate throughout the year, he may keep making moves to reshape the Pronghorns in a meaningful way. Since I think Cam is going to run away with pretty much every award, GM of the Year is no different. Getting Giannis, still stacking assets, creating an overall culture in Flint that should last for years, while myself and Gary have just as good of a chance, and I'll give some dark horse love to Mike and Anthony as well. When you separate yourself as the best team in the league any given year, you pretty much run away with everything because you usually do everything right, so I'm going to pick Cam again for what I assume will be a fantastic season, although I may be right there at a close second. As for all fantasy, I see this as a pretty easy trio of names. It's like I leave Cam off somehow after predicting him to win everything else. No, Cam will be here representing the Tropics with his second selection to the all fantasy team. Gary should still be the best team in the West and one of the best in the league, so I got him repeating for his second selection as well. And finally, the Knights haven't missed an all fantasy team yet, so I don't see that changing unless people really don't want to reward me. There's a possibility Gio can keep the Magoos in the same conversation as last year to repeat with his second selection. Mike has a team powered by Jokic that could lift him high enough in the standings to receive all fantasy honors himself. And if the Mad Hatters stay healthy, Gian could be one of the best teams in the league too. But if I was a betting man, I'd go Cam, Joe, and Gary. I mean, throughout 4 seasons in the DBL, every year has seen Joe and 2 new names join him on the all fantasy squad. So because of this pattern, you could guess Joe, Mike, and Gian as the future 2024 class, but that'd be a long shot, I think. However, still feasible. My favorite and least favorite award at the same time to talk about is All Dumbass. I hate making people feel like they're all dumbass worthy this early on, but at the same time, it's fun to see my estimations come to fruition or be the complete opposite. It's cool this year too because we have 3 newcomers entering the mix, and for the most part, I don't think league members really like voting rookies for this because it's an entirely new landscape to them, and they're kind of expected to do quote-unquote dumb things. That being said, I think Alec might be making the team even though he was dealt the worst hand. He joined with 2 weeks left of the offseason and couldn't have gotten a worse roster in terms of win-now talent. He's going to make mistakes along the way and probably already has, but the main reason he'll get votes is because his team isn't going to be very good, and when you try to break down who else is going to be bad this year, it's hard to guarantee any other names. However, that's why with the next selection, I'm going Josh. If Josh actually continued the rebuild he set off to begin at the end of last year, I think we'd all be a little more forgiving with his team's lackluster performance. But now, the McLovins are primed to be below average, and a lot of it is going to directly correlate with his decisions. The management style is all over the place right now. Unless Maryland finds their way into the playoffs, I'd imagine they're getting their second all-dumbass selection. Lastly, I'm going to have to go with James and the Whales receiving their second in a row. There's a good chance, obviously, that Las Vegas is good, but if they're not at least a top 5 team, I see James getting votes. For starters, he dropped Jalen Williams for nothing over the offseason when I know damn well there were a handful of bidders that probably would have even offered him multiple first rounders. On top of that, people still might be sour about last year's performance. If Wemby is amazing, people are going to be a little resentful, especially if the Whales have a piss-poor record. James also doesn't make a lot of trades or movement, which you could argue has certainly hurt his team, and if the Whales miss the postseason, as I'm assuming will happen, that could be the final nail in the coffin to give James another all-dumbass dishonor. But 2 of these guys will escape the ill-fated title of Dumbass of the Year, with my winner being Josh. Alex too new for people to give his career this much of a stain, and I can't definitively say that James is going to have a bad record, so logically it falls to the Maryland McLovins. I don't think it's going to be a great year for Josh, and his perplexing choices thus far have resulted in bad ideas. I could be totally wrong. The McLovins, in theory, still have a decent roster, but I don't know. It's so competitive between all of us that this is a difficult one to project, but I've got Josh receiving his first ever Dumbass of the Year. So that's going to do it for my predictions and analysis, fellas. I hope I'm wrong about a lot of things, but I hope I'm right too, because it's just fun seeing both sides play out and what side of the coin where it all falls and such. I totally butchered the end of this. Either way, good luck to everyone this year. DBL Season 5 starts now.